Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the time 78 slaves with kitchen knives nearly brought the Roman Empire to its knees. A Thracian warrior turned gladiator named Spartacus would force Rome to crucify 6,000 men along a single road just to prove who still held power. The rebellion started in a training school where men learned to die entertainingly, and it ended with 3 Roman armies hunting desperately for an enemy they'd created themselves by deciding human beings made acceptable entertainment. The truly insane part? Rome learned absolutely nothing from it. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about history. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We're sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. You're 33 years old in the year 73 BC. You've never seen a democratic election, or questioned whether slavery might be wrong. You've never imagined a world where men don't own other men like cattle. You know the gods choose who rules and who serves the way. You know winter follows autumn. Jupiter favours Rome because Rome conquers everyone else. Simple truth. No debate required. Spartacus had seen more than most men in that world. Born in Thrace, the mountainous region north of Greece, he'd fought as a warrior before Roman auxiliaries recruited him. Betrayal or desertion landed him in chains. Accounts differ, but the result was identical. The legion sold him to a lanista named Lentulus Batiatus, who ran a ludus gladiatorius in Capua, 70 miles south of Rome. The gladiator school trained human beings to butcher each other while crowds cheered and placed bets. The ludus sat like a prison because it was won. High walls, locked gates, armed guards rotating in shifts, cells instead of barracks, iron chains at night. Batiatus owned nearly 200 men representing investments he protected obsessively. A gladiator who escaped meant lost money, lost prestige, potential execution for the lanista if authorities decided he'd been negligent. The business model depended on breaking men psychologically before teaching them to kill. Training consumed every daylight hour. Wooden swords first, called rudis, swung until shoulders screamed and hands bled. The doctors, gladiator trainers who'd survived the arena, taught specific fighting styles matched to body types. Mumio fighters carried rectangular shields and short swords, mimicking legionaries. Thrax gladiators like Spartacus wielded curved seeker swords and small square shields, representing foreign barbarians for Roman crowds to watch die. Retiarius fighters used nets and tridents, giving up armour for mobility. Each style had counters, weaknesses, theatrical possibilities. The doctores beat mistakes out of recruits with wooden staffs. Hesitation earned strikes across the back. Poor footwork meant extra hours drilling movements until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. Men who couldn't learn fast enough disappeared, sold to worse schools, sent to die in provincial games nobody important attended, occasionally found dead in cells from despair, or deliberately provoked fights with guards, not sweat soaking through tunics. The ludus stank of men pushed past human endurance, of infections from wounds that healed poorly, of the olive oil rubbed into skin before training to prevent chafing. Blood mixed with sand in the practice arena each day. Doctores scraped it clean each evening using iron rakes, but the smell lingered in wood and stone. New recruits vomited from the stench until their bodies adjusted. Food arrived twice daily in quantities calculated to build muscle without wasting money. Barley porridge, beans, occasional meat gristle. Gladiators ate better than field slaves, but worse than free labourers. Batiatus invested in bodies the way farmers invest in plough horses, enough nutrition to maintain the asset, not enough to encourage thoughts of resistance through full bellies. Nights brought different torments. Guards chained men to their cells in groups, wrists connected to prevent individual escape attempts. The iron grew familiar against skin, rubbing calluses that marked gladiators as clearly as brands marked other slaves. Some men wept in darkness. Others planned impossible escapes. Most simply endured, measuring life in days until their next fight, wondering if the next crowd would gesture thumbs up for life or thumbs down for death. Spartacus had killed 12 men in the arena by 73 BC. Each fight followed the same pattern. Parade into the amphitheatre while crowds roared, face an opponent in similar circumstances, try to survive long enough to hear the roar shift from bloodlust to appreciation for skill. Winning meant living another month. Losing meant bleeding out in sand while attendants dressed as Charon, the ferryman dragged corpses away with hooks. The best gladiators became celebrities, their names painted on walls, their fighting styles analysed by enthusiasts, most simply died young in forgotten provincial games. But something shifted in the spring of that year. Spartacus began noticing patterns in the ludus routines. Guards changed shifts at predictable times. Kitchen slaves moved unsupervised through certain areas. The weapons room stayed locked, but kitchen knives, meat cleavers, and iron cooking implements went uncounted. Training weapons, though wooden, could crack skulls if swung properly. The wall had weak points where stone met mortar in older sections. Other men noticed his attention shifting from pure survival to calculation. Crixus, a Gaul with arms like tree trunks and a hatred of Romans that burned cold and permanent, began spending more time near Spartacus during training. Eunomius, a German who stood 6.5 feet tall and moved like a dancer despite his size, started asking questions disguised as casual conversation. 2 men from Gaul, whose names history lost, also joined, whispered discussions. They needed 78 men minimum. Fewer meant insufficient numbers to overcome guards. More meant someone would inform in hopes of reward. Batiatus paid informants well. Freedom sometimes, or privileges that made slavery slightly less unbearable. The conspiracy grew slowly, adding recruits who demonstrated willingness to die rather than continue the current existence. Veterans who'd survived years in the arena. New arrivals who hadn't yet broken. Men with nothing left to lose measured against men with nothing to gain from loyalty. The kitchen provided the first weapons. Gladiators assigned to meal preparation, considered trustworthy because they'd been there longest, began hiding implements in their tunics. A cleaver tucked into a waistband, knives wrapped in cloth and concealed in cells during inspections, iron skewers that could punch through a man's throat. Batiatus's guards never imagined slaves would dare arm themselves inside the ludus, so they never searched thoroughly. Training weapons came next. The wooden rudies that trainees swung for hours weighed similarly to real swords. Edges might be dull, points might be rounded, but sufficient force applied to a human skull produced the same result as a rock or club. The practice arena contained barrels of these weapons, accessible during training hours. If revolt came during daytime, they'd have armaments immediately. The date approached through signs obvious only to conspirators. Spring weather meant more games scheduled in nearby cities. Batiatus would soon transport fighters to smaller arenas, spreading his stable across Campania. The group would fracture, lose cohesion, possibly lose the moment entirely. The escape needed to happen soon, before circumstances changed. Spartacus made the decision in late spring 73 BC. The plan was breathtakingly simple. Overwhelm the guards during afternoon training, seize real weapons from the locked armory, break through the main gate before reinforcements arrive from Capua's garrison. Speed mattered more than complexity. Surprise would last minutes at most. In those minutes they either succeeded or died. The afternoon arrived unremarkably. Guards rotated as scheduled. Kitchen slaves delivered the midday meal. Training began under the usual supervision of doctores and armed overseers. 78 men spread across the practice areas, apparently focused on drills and sparring matches. The sun climbed toward its peak. Then someone screamed. The sound came from the kitchen area. Guards turned instinctively toward the disturbance. In that moment of divided attention, Spartacus and Crixus moved. They'd positioned themselves near the practice weapon barrels throughout the morning. Wooden swords came up fast, swung at guard faces before armor could help. The first overseer dropped with his jaw shattered. The second managed to draw his gladius before Oenomaus crushed his skull from behind. 78 men erupted simultaneously across the ludus. Guards died in seconds, overwhelmed by numbers and shock. The doctors tried to organize resistance, but gladiators who'd been beaten and degraded by these same trainers showed no mercy. Iron kitchen implements found throats and groins. Practice weapons became clubs that kept swinging until movement stopped. The armory door stood locked and reinforced. Spartacus grabbed keys from a dead guard, hands steady despite blood covering his arms. The lock turned. Inside, real weapons lined walls in organized rows. Gladi-swords, spears, shields, armor pieces. The equipment meant only for arena performances. Men grabbed whatever fit their training. Mumio fighters found their rectangular shields. Thrax warriors like Spartacus seized their curved blades. Retiarius specialists grabbed their nets and tridents. One guard managed to reach the main gate and bar it from the inside before the mob arrived. Foolish heroism or panic? The result was identical. Locked gates meant delay, and delay meant garrison troops from Capua might arrive before the gladiators escaped. Spartacus ordered men to the walls instead. They climbed using each other's bodies as ladders, dropped to streets outside, then opened the gate from the external side. The entire ludus emptied in minutes. Capua's streets erupted into chaos. Citizens fled screaming from armed men who'd been property an hour earlier. The gladiators ran toward the city limits, knowing soldiers would mobilize fast. Some stopped to grab supplies from shops or taverns. Others seized horses from stables. Spartacus kept moving, understanding that every second inside Capua increased the chance of encirclement. A wagon met them on the road outside the city. Pure fortune, or perhaps arrangement by sympathetic slaves, accounts differ. The wagon carried gladiatorial equipment being transported to games in another city. Swords, spears, armor. Professional weapons meant for entertainment now arming a rebellion. The 78 took everything, then vanished into the countryside before Capua's garrison even understood what had happened. Mount Vesuvius rose 10 miles to the northwest, a dormant volcano whose slopes offered caves, forest cover, and defensive terrain. Spartacus led his men there, knowing pursuit would come but betting that trained gladiators could outfight whatever force Rome initially sent. The mountain would either become their fortress or their tomb. News of the escape spread through slave populations faster than official messengers could carry reports. Field workers heard that gladiators had killed their masters and fled. House slaves learned that the impossible had happened. Armed resistance had succeeded, at least temporarily. Miners heard whispers that someone was fighting back. Within days, slaves began disappearing from farms and workshops around Capua, heading toward Vesuvius and whatever was happening there. The 78 became hundreds, then thousands. Slaves arrived with stories of brutality that made the ludus seem mild. Families separated permanently, children sold away from mothers, torture for minor infractions, rape as routine entertainment, death from exhaustion or starvation. They came with field tools that could serve as weapons, knowledge of a local geography, supplies stolen from masters. They came because Spartacus represented something no slave had seen in generations: successful resistance. Rome's response came swiftly but carelessly. The Senate dispatched Gaius Claudius Glaber, a praetor with 3,000 militia troops. Not legionaries. Actual soldiers were campaigning in Spain and the East. Just militia, local recruits and veterans called up for emergency service. The Senate viewed this as police action, not war. Slaves with stolen weapons hiding on a mountain required suppression, not a proper military campaign. Glaber surrounded the base of Mount Vesuvius and settled in to wait. His strategy made sense. The mountain had only one usable path down, and he controlled it. Spartacus and his followers were trapped at the summit with limited supplies. Hunger would force surrender within weeks, possibly days. Glaber sent messengers to Rome reporting imminent success. Spartacus studied the terrain and saw what Glaber missed. Wild grapevines grew thick on the mountain's far side, the steep slope that Romans considered impassable. The vines could support weight. Men could climb down, one at a time, in darkness. It would take all night and risk broken necks from falls, but desperation makes impossible tasks achievable. The descent began after sunset when Glaber's troops settled into evening routines. Gladiators went first, weapons strapped to backs, lowering themselves hand over hand down vines that cut palms and tested strength. Then the other slaves, less trained but motivated by certain death if they remained. Some fell, most made it. By dawn, thousands of armed men stood behind the Roman camp while Glaber's attention remained fixed on the mountain path ahead. The attack came at first light. Glaber's militia woke to screams and dying as gladiators tore through tents from the rear. The Romans never formed battle lines, never organized resistance. It was slaughter, not combat. 3,000 militia troops scattered or died, leaving behind weapons, armor, supplies, and camp equipment. Glaber himself barely escaped, fleeing on foot toward Capua with news that would stun the Senate. Spartacus now commanded a real army with Roman military equipment. The slave rebellion had become something infinitely more dangerous, and Rome still didn't understand what they were facing. Glaber's defeat sent shockwaves through every slaveholding household in Italy. The news travelled through whispers in kitchens, through coded messages passed between field workers, through the suddenly careful way masters watch their property. 3,000 armed Romans had lost to escaped gladiators and farm slaves. The impossible had documentation now, witnesses who'd fled the massacre carrying proof that resistance could succeed. Spartacus understood he'd crossed a threshold that offered no return. Surrender meant crucifixion for everyone. Roman law prescribed this death for rebellious slaves specifically because its prolonged agony served as public warning. The cross could take days to kill, death arriving through suffocation as exhausted muscles failed to lift the body for breath. Spartacus had seen these executions lining roads throughout his years in Roman territory. He'd never imagined himself as the cause of mass crucifixions, yet here he stood with thousands of followers and blood-soaked Roman equipment. The army needed structure to survive beyond its initial victories. Gladiators provided the leadership corps, men trained in combat, accustomed to discipline, capable of teaching fighting techniques to raw recruits. Spartacus organized them into units based on weapon types and experience. Former Mamaeo fighters who understood shield formations led infantry sections. Thraex warriors took flanking positions. Retiaria specialists scouted and skirmished. The gladiators became centurions in an army that shouldn't exist. Field slaves arrived daily from estates across Campania, swelling the force beyond anything Spartacus had anticipated. 10,000 within the first week, 20,000 by the second. These weren't soldiers. They were property fleeing lives of agricultural labour, bodies ruined by endless work, minds shaped by systematic degradation. But rage makes men teachable. Spartacus drilled them in basic formations, taught them to hold lines, showed them how shields could create walls that Roman cavalry couldn't break. Women joined the revolt alongside men, fleeing sexual slavery and domestic servitude. They couldn't fight in traditional roles, but armies need logistics more than heroics. Food required constant procurement from raids on nearby estates. Weapons needed maintenance. Wounded men needed care. The rebellion became a moving community of 40,000 people by midsummer, all dependent on Spartacus maintaining momentum before Rome's real legions returned from foreign campaigns. The Senate dispatched Publius Varinius with 4,000 troops, another praetor leading another inadequate force. Rome still refused to acknowledge this as genuine war requiring consular armies. Varinius brought proper soldiers this time, veterans recalled from retirement, young men completing their military service. His strategy mimicked Glaber's: contain the slaves, cut supply lines, force starvation or surrender. Roman military doctrine against barbarian tribes worked reliably for centuries. Varinius saw no reason to innovate against property. Spartacus split his army for the first time, sending detachments to raid estates while maintaining his main force at Vesuvius. The raids brought supplies and recruits, but more importantly they spread terror through Italy's slave-owning class. Slaves who'd seemed docile for years suddenly murdered masters in the night and fled to join the rebellion. Overseers found themselves gutted by their own workers. Estate owners woke to burning villas and missing property. The psychological impact exceeded the material damage. Every Roman master now feared their slaves might be the next to revolt. Varinius attempted to blockade the rebels, positioning his forces to intercept supply raids. Spartacus outmaneuvered him through superior intelligence. Escaped slaves knew every farm, every road, every hiding place in the region. Roman troops marched into prepared ambushes, where gladiators used terrain advantages to nullify numerical disadvantages. Varinius lost hundreds of men in small engagements that accomplished nothing except demonstrating his incompetence. The praetor tried changing tactics, sending his quaestor Lucius Cassinius with 2,000 men to probe rebel positions. Cassinius located Spartacus's camp near Salinae and settled nearby to observe, planning to attack once Varinius arrived with reinforcements. Spartacus attacked first, hitting the Roman camp during afternoon rest periods, when soldiers had removed armour and stacked weapons. Cassinius died in his tent, still half-dressed. His entire force dissolved, survivors fleeing in whatever direction offered escape. Varinius marched his remaining troops toward the disaster, learned en route that his quaestor was dead, and discovered Spartacus waiting in prepared positions. The battle lasted less than an hour. Roman formations broke under assault from gladiators who'd spent years studying how legionaries fought. The rebels knew every weakness in Roman shield walls, every gap in their tactics, every moment when discipline created exploitable rigidity. Varinius fled on foot, abandoning his horse and the fasces, the bundle of rods and axe that symbolized Roman authority. Slaves now carried the literal symbols of Roman power. The victory brought 70,000 followers to Spartacus by autumn of 73 BC. The army controlled most of southern Italy, moving freely while Roman forces cowered in fortified cities. Estates burned across Campania and Lucania. Slave revolts erupted in regions nowhere near Spartacus's direct influence, inspired by news of his successes. The Senate finally acknowledged reality. This required consular intervention, proper legions, Rome's full military attention. Both consuls for 72 BC received orders to deal with the slave rebellion. Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, commanding 4 legions between them, roughly 24,000 professional soldiers. These weren't militia or recalled veterans. These were Rome's frontline troops with cavalry support, siege equipment, and commanders who'd fought Mithridates and Mediterranean pirates. The Senate authorized whatever force proved necessary to end the rebellion permanently. Spartacus faced a decision that would define everything following. His army now numbered beyond anything manageable. Estimates ranged from 70 to 120,000 people, counting fighters and followers. They couldn't sustain themselves in southern Italy indefinitely. Roman legions would arrive in spring. The rebellion needed strategy beyond surviving the next battle. The plan emerged through councils with his commanders: march north toward the Alps, cross the mountains into Gaul and Germania, disperse the army, let people return to their homelands now that they'd tasted freedom. Spartacus wasn't building an empire or attempting to overthrow Rome. He wanted escape, wanted to survive, wanted his followers to live somewhere beyond Roman vengeance. The Alpine passes would open in spring. They'd march north, defeat whatever forces block their path, and disappear into barbarian lands where Roman authority meant nothing. But Crixus disagreed violently. The Gallic commander wanted revenge, wanted to burn every Roman villa in Italy, wanted masters to experience the terror they'd inflicted for generations. His followers, 30,000 Gauls and Germans, refused to flee north when so much Roman wealth remained unplundered in the south. The army fractured along ethnic and strategic lines. Crixus led his faction toward richer territories in Apulia. Spartacus continued north with the remaining 70,000, hoping Crixus would eventually rejoin once he'd satisfied his bloodlust. The split gave Rome its opening. Gellius Publicola intercepted Crixus's army near Mount Garganus in Apulia. The Gauls fought with characteristic fury but lacked Spartacus's tactical brilliance. Roman legions held formations while gladiators and former slaves exhausted themselves in frontal assaults. When discipline broke, the legionaries advanced methodically, cutting down fleeing rebels. Crixus died fighting. Sources claim he killed 20 Romans before spears finally brought him down. His entire force of 30,000 was destroyed in a single afternoon. News of the massacre reached Spartacus in northern Italy. He'd lost a third of his army and his most aggressive commander. The Romans would be emboldened, pursuing with confidence now. But grief could wait. The Alpine passes beckoned. Freedom waited beyond the mountains, and the remainder of his followers needed leadership more than they needed mourning. Spartacus turned his army around. The decision baffled historians for 2 millennia afterward. Why, with freedom within reach, did Spartacus march back toward Rome? Ancient sources offer theories. His men refused to leave Italy, or he wanted revenge for Crixus, or he hoped to ignite wider slave revolts across the peninsula. Modern scholars debate whether Spartacus ever truly intended to leave, or if the northern march was always faint to split Roman forces. The truth died with him. But the turn south changed everything. The rebellion transformed from escape attempt into existential threat. Spartacus marched directly toward Rome itself, his army swelling again as slaves joined what now appeared to be a conquering force. He defeated both consular armies in separate engagements, killing thousands of legionaries and capturing military equipment on a scale that transformed his followers into a legitimate army. At Picenum, he crushed the forces of Cassius Longinus so completely that the proconsul fled to avoid capture. Rome entered genuine panic for the first time in generations. Spartacus commanded over 100,000 fighters within a week's march of the capital. The legions had failed. The consuls had failed. Every conventional response had crumbled against a Thracian slave who'd learned warfare in Rome's own auxiliary units. Citizens hoarded food, wealthy families evacuated to country estates, and the Senate debated whether the city itself could withstand siege. Spartacus made his position clear through actions that resonated across Italy. He captured 300 Roman prisoners, legionaries and officers, and forced them to fight as gladiators for his army's entertainment. The symbolism was perfect and terrible. Romans who cheered gladiatorial games for centuries now died in the sand for the amusement of slaves. Some accounts claim Spartacus made them fight in pairs, like arena matches, while his followers placed bets and cheered for favourites. Others say he simply massacred them in a single day of retribution. Then he crucified 300 more Romans in revenge for Crixus and the thousands who died at Garganus. The crosses lined roads exactly as Rome lined roads with crucified slaves. The message required no explanation. Spartacus understood Roman methods and would respond in kind. He wasn't asking for mercy or hoping for negotiation. This was war, and wars ended with one side destroyed. The Senate realized conventional commanders wouldn't suffice. They needed someone ruthless enough to match Spartacus' determination, someone wealthy enough to fund operations without draining the treasury, someone ambitious enough to see this crisis as opportunity. They needed Marcus Licinius Crassus. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about history. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. Crassus was Rome's richest citizen, having built his fortune through real estate schemes, slave trading, and political manipulation. He'd served as praetor and commanded troops in Sulla's civil war, demonstrating both tactical competence and willingness to use extreme measures. More importantly, he possessed wealth to raise and equip legions without Senate appropriations, an ambition to leverage military success into political dominance. The Senate appointed him supreme commander with 6 new legions, and authority to recall 2 more from northern Italy. 48,000 fresh troops under unified command. Crassus inherited 2 legions that had already lost to Spartacus. These forces were demoralized, undisciplined, and terrified of slaves who'd killed so many of their comrades. Officers had lost control. Soldiers deserted at the first rumour of rebel approach. The legions functioned as mobs wearing armour rather than fighting forces. Crassus needed to restore order before engaging the enemy. He chose decimation, an ancient Roman punishment so severe that commanders rarely implemented it even against cowardly troops. Every 10th man would die, selected by lot from the entire unit, beaten to death by his fellow soldiers using clubs and stones. Crassus assembled the 2 disgraced legions, organized them into groups of 10, and drew lots. 4,000 men watched as their friends and tentmates were randomly selected for execution. Then they picked up clubs and killed them. The decimation restored discipline through terror. The surviving legionaries understood their commander would kill them personally if they failed, understood that death from Crassus might arrive sooner than death from slaves. They stopped deserting. They held formations during training. They became soldiers again, welded together by shared horror at what they'd witnessed and participated in. Crassus had his army, but Spartacus still held the initiative. His force ranged across southern Italy, evading direct confrontation while raiding continuously for supplies. Crassus shadowed him, refusing pitched battle, waiting for the right conditions. The rebellion had momentum. Rome had resources. Something had to break. That break would come in the toe of Italy, where geography and betrayal would finally trap the slave army between converging Roman forces. But for now, in autumn of 72 BC, Spartacus remained undefeated and free. The war had just entered its bloodiest phase. Crassus understood that chasing Spartacus across Italy meant perpetual failure. The slave army moved faster than legions burdened with supply trains. knew terrain intimately through escaped slaves from every region, and could live off plundered estates while Roman forces required organised logistics. Traditional pursuit would accomplish nothing except exhausting troops and wasting time. Crassus needed to force battle on his terms, in locations where Roman discipline could overwhelm rebel numbers. The strategy emerged through cold calculation rather than military brilliance. Drive Spartacus south toward Italy's toe, the narrow peninsula of Bruttium where geography limited movement. Plug the narrow isthmus connecting Bruttium to the mainland. Trap the entire rebel army in a confined space where they'd starve or be forced to attack prepared Roman positions. The plan required brutal simplicity. Build a wall across the entire isthmus, 40 miles from sea to sea, and wait for desperation to break the slaves. Spartacus initially ignored the construction, dismissing it as impossible Roman arrogance. 40 miles of fortifications through mountains and marshes would take months, require enormous resources, and still leave gaps his forces could exploit. He continued raiding southern estates, accumulating supplies for winter, training new recruits who still arrived daily despite Crixus' defeat. The rebellion had become self-sustaining, each victory attracting more followers, each follower needing to be fed through more raids. But Crassus had resources that made impossible tasks merely expensive. His personal wealth funded the construction when Senate appropriations proved insufficient. He mobilized 40,000 legionaries as construction crews, rotating combat units through fortification duty. The wall grew with terrifying speed, 15 feet high, backed by a trench 15 feet deep and equally wide. Wooden palisades topped the earthworks. Guard towers rose every 100 yards. By late autumn of 72 BC, the fortification stretched nearly complete across the isthmus. Spartacus recognized the trap too late. His army of over 100,000 people now occupied Bruttium, with a single exit being systematically closed by Roman engineering. The peninsula couldn't support that many mouths indefinitely. Winter would deplete game and remaining food stocks. Raids northward meant attacking the very fortifications designed to contain them. The strategic situation had reversed. Spartacus was besieged without walls, trapped by geography and Roman persistence. He attempted negotiation for the first time since the rebellion began. Messengers approached Roman lines under truce flags, carrying offers to leave Italy peacefully in exchange for safe passage. Spartacus would march his entire army to the coast, board ships, and sail anywhere Rome desired as long as his followers lived. The proposal held genuine strategic value for Rome, eliminating the rebellion without further combat, freeing legions for deployment elsewhere, ending the embarrassment cheaply. Crassus refused immediately. He needed total military victory, needed the glory that came from crushing Rome's enemies completely. Political rivals like Pompey had won fame through foreign conquests. Crassus required his own triumph, his own subjugated foes march through Rome's streets. Escaped slaves offered perfect enemies, universally despised, their defeat universally celebrated, and their destruction carrying no diplomatic consequences. Every rebel who survived represented glory denied to Crassus personally. The rejection left Spartacus with stark options: attack the fortifications and lose thousands breaking through, wait and starve, or attempt something so audacious that Romans wouldn't anticipate it. He chose the third path, contacting Cilician pirates who operated throughout the Mediterranean. These pirates had raided Roman shipping for decades, knew every coastal route, and cared nothing for Rome's laws. Spartacus offered them gold and plunder from captured estates in exchange for transport to Sicily. Sicily represented strategic genius if the plan succeeded. The island had endured 2 massive slave revolts within living memory, producing populations sympathetic to rebellion. Wealthy estates covered Sicily's interior, offering supplies and recruitment opportunities. Most critically, Sicily's geographic position would force Rome to mount amphibious operations or prolonged sieges, neither of which Roman forces had prepared for. The slave army could survive indefinitely on an island while Rome's legions remained trapped on the mainland. The Cilician pirates agreed to the arrangement. They would provide ships to transport Spartacus's entire force across the Strait of Messina, that narrow water separating Italy from Sicily. The crossing required multiple trips. Even pirate fleets couldn't move 100,000 people simultaneously. But the strait was only 2 miles wide at its narrowest point. Coordinated operations could complete the evacuation before Romans even realized what was happening. Spartacus gathered his gold, years of plundered estates, accumulated wealth from 100 conquered villas, payment for services the pirates would never render. The ships arrived on schedule at the designated beach. Then they sailed away with the gold and disappeared into the Mediterranean. The pirates had no intention of fighting Rome's entire military establishment for one payment, however large. Betrayal was business, nothing personal. The strategic situation collapsed instantly. Spartacus remained trapped in Brutium with winter approaching, supplies dwindling, and Crassus's wall now completely sealed. The brief hope of escape made the reality of confinement more crushing. Morale deteriorated as followers realized their commander had been outmaneuvered. Some units began deserting, trying to escape individually through the fortifications. Roman guards crucified captured deserters within sight of the slave army as encouragement for others considering flight. Winter arrived early that year in southern Italy. Snow fell in mountains where it rarely appeared, temperatures dropped below freezing at night, and the already strained food supplies became critical shortages. Spartacus ordered reduced rations, rationing that affected women and children travelling with the army more severely than fighters. People began dying from exposure and starvation. The rebellion that had terrified Rome for 2 years was slowly being destroyed by calendar and geography. Crassus received welcome news during the siege. The Senate had recalled Pompey from Spain, where he'd been fighting Sertorius's rebellion. Pompey would bring battle-hardened legions to Italy, providing overwhelming force to crush any breakout attempt. Additionally, Marcus Lucullus was sailing from Macedonia with more troops, creating a 3-army vice around Spartacus. The Senate wanted this rebellion ended before another campaign season began, wanted assurance that slaves across Italy understood resistance meant annihilation. Spartacus understood waiting meant death. The breakout attempt came during a snowstorm in December, when visibility dropped to yards and guard towers became isolated posts. The slaves filled sections of Crassus's trench with earth, timber, and the bodies of dead animals, creating crude bridges across the 15-foot gap. They attacked during the worst hours of the storm, thousands pouring toward a single point in the fortifications chosen for slightly lower elevation and slightly thinner garrison. The assault succeeded through desperation and weather. Roman guards couldn't see attackers until they reached the earthworks. The filled trench sections held long enough for the first wave to crest the walls. Hand-to-hand combat in blizzard conditions favoured neither side, but sheer numbers eventually overwhelmed the defenders. Spartacus drove his entire army through the breach before Crassus could organise reinforcements. By dawn, the slaves had escaped the trap and vanished into the Italian interior. The breakout cost 15,000 lives, fighters killed in the assault, followers who died from exposure during the night march, wounded who couldn't keep pace and were left behind. Crassus crucified every survivor found near the breach, planting crosses along the fortification as evidence of what awaited those who challenged Rome. But 70,000 slaves had escaped his carefully prepared trap. The rebellion continued. Spartacus turned north again, apparently attempting another march toward the Alps. His army moved rapidly despite winter conditions, evading Crassus's pursuit through forced marches that killed hundreds daily from exhaustion. They needed to reach the Alpine passes before spring, when all three Roman armies could coordinate attacks. Geography became ally again. Mountain terrain negated Roman numerical advantages, and barbarian tribes beyond the passes might shelter refugees if properly incentivized. Then messengers arrived carrying intelligence that shattered this strategy. Pompey had landed in northern Italy and was marching south to block the Alpine approaches. Lucullus had arrived in Brundisium with fresh legions and was securing the eastern coast. Crassus pursued from the south with 48,000 troops. The three-army vice was closing, and this time no single wall could be breached to escape. Spartacus stood trapped between three of Rome's finest commanders with nowhere left to run. Some of Spartacus's followers broke away, refusing to continue a campaign that seemed doomed. Gannicus and Castus led 12,000 Gauls and Germans separately, apparently hoping smaller forces could escape where the main army couldn't. Spartacus let them go without resistance. Unity had dissolved under the pressure of endless pursuit and absent alternatives. The slave army fractured into desperate bands seeking individual survival. Crassus intercepted Gannicus and Castus near Mount Camalatrum in Lucania. The battle lasted 3 hours and ended with both rebel commanders dead and their entire force annihilated. Roman cavalry ran down fleeing survivors for miles, killing thousands who'd thrown away weapons to run faster. Not one prisoner was taken. Crassus had abandoned any pretense of clemency. Every rebel would die, whether in battle or afterward. Spartacus learned of the massacre while retreating through Lucania with his remaining 60,000 followers. He still commanded more fighters than any single Roman army, but they were exhausted, starving, and increasingly demoralized by continuous defeats of splinter groups. The rebellion had lasted 2 years, travelled the length of Italy twice, destroyed 9 Roman armies, and killed tens of thousands of legionaries. But numbers were catching up. Rome had infinite resources. Spartacus had only what his followers could carry. The final confrontation was approaching inevitably. Crassus had cornered the slave army in Lucania, with Pompey closing from the north and Lucullus securing potential escape routes to the east. Spartacus could try fighting through one of the 3 forces, could attempt to disperse his army into small bands that might escape individually, or could stand and fight one last battle against Rome's assembled might. None of these options offered survival. All guaranteed death for the majority of his followers. Spartacus chose battle, not from hope of victory. He demonstrated too much tactical brilliance to deceive himself about the outcome. The decision came from understanding that running meant slow destruction through starvation and piecemeal annihilation. Standing meant controlling how his rebellion ended, meant fighting Rome directly one final time, meant dying like a warrior rather than hunted prey. His followers deserved that choice. The location was the upper Silurus River valley in Lucania, spring of 71 BC. Spartacus positioned his army on elevated ground with the river protecting one flank. Crassus deployed 48,000 legionaries in traditional Roman formations, heavy infantry centre, cavalry wings, reserves positioned to exploit any breakthrough. The rebels numbered around 60,000 but included many non-combatants and poorly armed recruits. The veteran gladiators and trained slaves who'd started the rebellion 2 years earlier had died in various battles. These were survivors, not soldiers. Spartacus made one final gesture before battle began. He ordered his horse brought forward, drew his gladius, and killed it personally. The symbolism resonated through both armies. No retreat, no escape, only victory or death. The horse that could carry him from defeat died by his own hand. He would fight alongside his men until Roman swords found him, or unlikely victory arrived. The battle commenced at dawn when Crassus ordered his legions forward. The slave army held formations initially, gladiators anchoring the line while less experienced fighters filled gaps. Roman testudo formations advanced methodically, shields locked overhead and to sides, infantry protected from missiles while closing distance. The rebels threw everything they had: javelins, rocks, captured Roman pila. Nothing stopped the advance. The lines met with the crash of shields and screaming that marked ancient combat. Gladiators fought with all their training, all their hatred, all their knowledge that surrender meant crucifixion. They killed Romans by the hundreds in the initial exchanges, but legionaries were trained to fight as units, not individuals. As soon as gladiator skill created openings, Roman reserves flowed through and surrounded the isolated champions. Excellence in personal combat couldn't overcome systematic coordination. Spartacus attempted to reach Crassus personally, trying to decapitate Roman command through direct assassination. Sources describe him cutting through ranks of legionaries, killing 2 centurions with his own hands, fighting with injuries that would have stopped lesser men. He came close enough to see Crassus on his horse, close enough that Roman bodyguards had to form emergency defensive perimeters. Then sheer weight of numbers pulled him down. The exact manner of Spartacus's death remains unclear. Some sources say wounds and exhaustion finally overwhelmed him, that he died fighting until his body simply failed. Others claim Roman soldiers surrounded and killed him without realizing his identity until examining corpses afterward. His body was never definitively identified among the thousands of dead covering the battlefield. He disappeared into the carnage, his final moments known only to the men who killed him. The slave army disintegrated once Spartacus fell. Organized resistance collapsed into individual flights toward any direction that appeared safe. Roman cavalry pursued for miles, cutting down fleeing refugees. Legionaries executed wounded rebels where they lay. The killing continued through the afternoon until Crassus finally called halt. 60,000 slaves had entered battle that morning. 6,000 survived as prisoners. The rest died in the valley or during pursuit. The Third Servile War ended in that Lucanian valley, but Rome's vengeance was just beginning. Pompey's legions intercepted 5,000 fleeing slaves near the northern border of Lucania 3 days after the final battle. These were refugees who'd escaped Crassus's slaughter, running toward the Alps in desperate groups that had abandoned weapons and cohesion. They posed no military threat, just exhausted people hoping distance might equal survival. Pompey ordered his cavalry to surround them and his infantry to advance in battle formation. The massacre took less than an hour. Pompey's troops killed every refugee, stripping bodies afterward for any valuables and burning corpses in mass pyres. The general then sent messengers racing to Rome claiming he'd defeated the remnants of Spartacus's army and ended the rebellion. The dispatch arrived before Crassus's own victory report, allowing Pompey to claim credit for finishing what Crassus had merely started. Political manoeuvring had begun before the final bodies cooled. Crassus received news of Pompey's claim while organising his 6,000 prisoners. The fury was immediate and personal. He'd funded legions from private wealth, decimated his own troops to restore discipline, built 40 miles of fortifications, and crushed Spartacus in direct battle. Now a rival was stealing glory through opportunistic slaughter of fleeing refugees. The insult demanded response, but Pompey commanded legions and political connections that made direct confrontation dangerous. Crassus needed a statement that would resonate beyond current political struggles. The 6,000 prisoners represented that opportunity. Roman law was explicit regarding slave rebellions, death by crucifixion for all participants. The punishment served dual purposes: prolonged suffering as deterrent and public display as warning. Individual crucifixions happened regularly across the empire. Mass crucifixions made history. Crassus intended to create something Rome would remember for centuries. The Appian Way stretched 132 miles from Rome to Capua, passing through the heart of Italy's slaveholding regions. The road had carried trade and legions for over 2 centuries, representing Roman engineering and authority. Crassus would transform it into a monument to Roman vengeance. 6,000 crosses would line the road from Capua, where the rebellion started, to Rome itself. 1 crucified slave every 40 yards for the entire distance. The display would take months to rot away, ensuring maximum exposure to the message. The logistics of mass crucifixion required systematic organization. Crassus assigned engineering detachments to construct crosses from available timber. The traditional Roman cross was T-shaped rather than the Christian symbol, familiar to later eras. A vertical post with a horizontal crossbeam nailed near the top. Each cross required roughly 70 pounds of wood, shaped and fitted with iron nails. 6,000 crosses meant over 200 tons of timber, processed quickly enough to prevent prisoner escapes or deaths before crucifixion. Slaves from loyal estates were conscripted as labour for the construction. The irony was deliberate. Property-building instruments to execute property that had rebelled. The enslaved workers cut trees, shaped beams, hammered nails, and dug post holes along the Appian Way under guard supervision. Some undoubtedly knew prisoners awaiting execution. Many certainly understood they were building warnings meant for themselves as much as for crucified rebels. The crosses rose along the road in groups as construction progressed. Vertical posts were set 3 feet deep in holes, packed with earth and stone for stability. Horizontal beams were attached at 7 feet height, creating the characteristic T-shape. Iron nails, valuable military supplies normally reserved for construction, pierced wood in quantities that represented significant expense. Crassus spared no cost. The spectacle required perfection. Prisoners were marched from temporary holding camps to their designated crosses in groups of 50, each group escorted by a century of legionaries. The procession took weeks to complete as construction finished different road sections. Prisoners knew their fate. Crucifixion was common enough that its mechanics required no explanation. The march to the cross was part of the punishment, time to contemplate the agony awaiting and the futility of rebellion. The crucifixion process followed, established Roman procedure refined through centuries of executing slaves and criminals. Victims were stripped completely. Nakedness added humiliation to suffering. Their arms were tied or nailed to the crossbeam, which was then lifted and attached to the vertical post. Feet were positioned against the post and nailed through the heel or ankle bones. The body's weight created the killing mechanism. Death arrived slowly through asphyxiation. Hanging by the arms prevented proper breathing unless the victim pushed up on nailed feet to expand the chest cavity. This created a cycle of agony: suffocate slowly, or push up against nailed feet, causing excruciating pain to draw breath, then collapse back into suffocation. The process could take days depending on the victim's strength and the efficiency of the crucifixion. Some died within hours, others lasted 3 days or more. Roman guards patrolled the road to prevent mercy killings or rescue attempts. Orders prohibited hastening death through spearing or breaking legs, traditional methods for ending crucifixion quickly. Crassus wanted maximum suffering duration, wanted travellers to pass dying slaves throughout their journeys, wanted the message to linger as long as physiologically possible. The guards prevented anyone from providing water or aid to the crucified. The first crosses filled with victims in late spring of 71 BC. Screaming echoed across farmland as nails pierced flesh and weight settled onto wounds. The sounds attracted carrion birds almost immediately. Crows and vultures learned quickly that the road offered easy meals. They perched on crossbeams and pecked at crucified slaves while victims still lived, going for eyes and soft tissues first. The birds became part of the horror, additional torment layered onto deliberate cruelty. Travellers on the Appian Way had no choice but to pass the spectacle. The road was Italy's main artery between Rome and the south. Merchants, messengers, military units, and civilian traffic used it constantly. Everyone who travelled between Rome and Capua that spring and summer witnessed 6,000 human beings dying slowly on crosses. The psychological impact exceeded any military victory. This was power made visible through systematic torture. Slave owners throughout Italy brought their property to view the crucifixions as educational experiences. Masters marched field slaves, house slaves, and workshop slaves past the crosses, pointing out specific victims and explaining what happened to slaves who forgot their place. The lesson was unmistakable and deliberately reinforced. Rebellion meant this, meant days of agony watched by crowds, meant body fluids running down legs while birds ate faces. Obedience meant avoiding this fate. The smell became overwhelming as bodies began dying. Crucifixion killed through slow organ failure, loss of blood circulation, dehydration, suffocation. Victims lost control of bodily functions during the process. 6,000 people dying over days and weeks in summer heat created a stench that travellers could smell miles before reaching the affected road sections. The olfactory assault became part of the message. Rebellion literally stank of death and degradation. Some victims maintained consciousness for extraordinary periods. Guards reported slaves still breathing after 4 days on crosses, bodies so destroyed by exposure and trauma that death seemed impossible yet refused to arrive. These prolonged deaths became stories told across Italy, exaggerated through retelling but rooted in documented fact. The human capacity for suffering was on full display, and Rome wanted everyone to witness that capacity's limits. Bodies remained on crosses long after death. Crassus prohibited removal, letting nature take its course. Decomposition in summer heat accelerated, flesh rotting off bones, skin turning black and sloughing away, eventually leaving skeletons still nailed to wood. The crosses became monuments of bone and rust by late summer. Birds and insects stripped the flesh efficiently. Rain and sun bleached the bones. The Appian Way transformed into an ossuary stretching 132 miles. The display remained visible for months before weather and decay finally destroyed it. Winter storms of 7170 BC toppled many crosses. Others collapsed as wood rotted. Eventually officials removed the remnants because they obstructed traffic and created sanitation issues. But the memory persisted in Roman consciousness for generations. Writers referenced the crucifixions as examples of appropriate responses to slave rebellion. Artists depicted the scene in murals and mosaics. The 6,000 crosses became synonymous with the price of defying Rome. Crassus received his triumph, the formal victory parade through Rome reserved for generals who'd achieved significant victories. The Senate granted this reluctantly, noting that triumphs traditionally celebrated defeats of foreign enemies, not suppressed internal rebellions. But political reality forced acknowledgement. Crassus had crushed Rome's most dangerous slave revolt using private resources and personal determination. Denying the triumph would insult a man wealthy and powerful enough to challenge Senate authority. The triumph proceeded with captured weapons, recovered Roman standards, and representations of the final battle carried through Rome's streets. Crassus rode in a gilded chariot, wearing laurel crown and purple toga, accepting cheers from crowds lining the processional route. Notably absent were the traditional captive enemy leaders displayed in chains before execution. Spartacus's body was never recovered. The rebellion's commanders were all dead on battlefields or crosses. The triumph celebrated victory over an enemy who'd already been destroyed. Pompey received ovation, a lesser honour than triumph, for his contributions to ending the rebellion. The distinction rankled. Pompey had won actual triumphs for foreign victories over Sertorius and Mediterranean pirates. Being relegated to secondary honours for the slave war while Crassus triumphed created resentment that would poison their relationship for years. The political consequences of the rebellion extended far beyond the military campaign. The Senate commissioned official histories celebrating Crassus's victory and Rome's power. These accounts emphasized Roman military superiority, downplayed early rebel victories, and portrayed Spartacus as lucky barbarian rather than tactical genius. The historical record was being shaped to serve political purposes, admitting that escaped slaves had humiliated Rome's finest generals for 2 years, undermined the message of invincible Roman authority. Official versions stressed the inevitable defeat of rebels who challenged destiny itself. But unofficial accounts told different stories. Soldiers who'd fought Spartacus spoke privately about his tactical brilliance, about gladiators who fought with discipline matching or exceeding Roman legionaries, about the terror of facing former slaves who understood Roman military doctrine intimately. These veterans knew they'd barely won despite overwhelming advantages in resources and numbers. The rebellion had revealed weaknesses in Roman military organization and slave control systems that couldn't be acknowledged publicly, but couldn't be ignored privately. Slave populations across Italy internalized the message of the crucifixions. Rebellions became unthinkable. The price had been demonstrated too clearly. Passive resistance continued through subtle sabotage and reduced efficiency, but open revolt disappeared for generations. Masters tightened controls, increased surveillance, and responded to minor infractions with brutal force. The brief window when slaves had glimpsed potential freedom closed permanently, sealed by 6,000 crosses. Yet something else had changed that would ultimately prove more significant than the rebellion itself. Crassus and Pompey both leveraged their victories into political power. They formed the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar, using military success to override republican traditions. The precedent of generals using armies to seize political control, established during Sulla's civil war and reinforced through the Spartacus campaign, would eventually destroy the Roman Republic. The slave rebellion that started with 78 gladiators escaping a training school had killed over 100,000 people across 3 years of warfare. It demonstrated that Rome's military invincibility was myth rather than fact. It proved that slaves could organize, fight, and win against professional legions. It exposed the Republic's dependence on slave labor and the vulnerability that dependence created. And it accelerated political trends that would, within a generation, replace the Republic with empire. Spartacus had wanted simply to escape, to lead his followers to freedom beyond Roman borders. He failed. His rebellion was crushed, his followers executed, his name used as warning rather than inspiration. But the rebellion's consequences rippled through Roman society in ways he never intended and couldn't have predicted. The crosses along the Appian Way marked more than the death of 6,000 slaves. They marked a transition point in Roman history, a moment when the Republic's contradictions became visible and its eventual fall became inevitable. The last crosses finally collapsed in late 70 BC, over a year after the rebellion ended. Workers cleared the debris, filled the post holes, and restored the road to normal function. Traffic resumed without the constant reminder of mass execution. Life returned to patterns established over centuries of Roman dominance. Except nothing was actually the same. Everyone who'd witnessed the crucifixions carried those memories, Everyone who'd heard the stories understood the new reality. Rome had won, but the victory's price included exposing the foundations of Roman power to scrutiny that would eventually topple them. Spartacus's body was never found. Whether lost among battlefield dead, destroyed beyond recognition, or secretly buried by followers remains unknown. The absence of his corpse prevented Rome from displaying the ultimate symbol of victory, the rebel leader's head on a pike or his body dragged through streets during triumph. Spartacus disappeared into history as mysteriously as he'd emerged, leaving only legends, warnings, and consequences that outlived everyone who'd fought in his rebellion. The Third Servile War ended, but its echoes would resound through Roman history for centuries and through human history for millennia. Every subsequent slave rebellion would reference Spartacus. Every discussion of slavery's morality would cite his resistance. Every examination of Rome's fall would trace threads back to the moment when a Thracian gladiator decided that freedom was worth dying for, and 78 men with kitchen knives agreed enough to change history. The Senate reconvened in summer of 70 BC, believing the slave crisis had ended with appropriate brutality. Senators congratulated themselves on swift resolution, efficient use of force, and clear messaging to slave populations throughout the empire. They had misread everything. The rebellion's true damage wasn't military casualties or economic disruption. It was the precedent of generals using armies for personal political advancement. Crassus refused to disband his legions after the triumph. Military tradition demanded victorious generals dismiss troops and return to civilian status once Senate granted honours. Crassus kept his 6 legions under arms outside Rome, citing ongoing security concerns about potential slave uprisings. The justification was transparently false. No credible threat existed. The legions remained assembled because Crassus intended to leverage military power into political concessions the Senate would never grant voluntarily. Pompey maintained his legions as well, having returned from Spain with forces that had fought Sertorius for years. His troops were battle-hardened veterans loyal to their commander rather than the Republic. Pompey demanded a triumph for his Spanish victories, deserved by any measure, but also demanded immediate consulship despite being legally too young and having never served as praetor. The Senate faced 2 generals with armies camped outside Rome, making demands backed by implicit military threat. The constitutional crisis was unprecedented in scope if not in kind. Sulla had marched on Rome twice in living memory, establishing the template for generals using legions to seize political power. But Sulla had been motivated by specific political enemies and immediately disbanded forces after achieving objectives. Crassus and Pompey showed no intention of surrendering military command, creating a permanent armed presence that reduced Senate authority to whatever the generals permitted. The Senate capitulated completely. Both men received consulships for 70 BC despite Pompey's age and Crassus's questionable legal standing. Traditional career progression, the cursus honorum that had governed Roman political advancement for centuries, became irrelevant when backed by legions. The Republic's constitutional framework had functioned through shared aristocratic commitment to rules limiting individual power. That commitment evaporated the moment holding military force proved more valuable than respecting tradition. Crassus and Pompey used their joint consulship to dismantle Sulla's constitutional reforms. They restored tribunician powers that Sulla had stripped, gave censors back their authority, and reopened access to offices Sulla had restricted. The changes appeared democratic, returning power to plebeian representatives and traditional magistrates. In reality, the consuls were removing checks on their own authority, while building popular support among classes that had lost influence under Sulla's oligarchic system. The 2 consuls despised each other with intensity that threatened violence. Crassus resented Pompey's glory stealing after the slave rebellion. Pompey scorned Crassus as a mere moneylender playing at generalship. Their political cooperation was purely transactional. Each needed the other's legions to overawe the Senate, but neither trusted their partner nor intended to maintain the alliance longer than necessary. Rome was being governed by armed rivals who barely tolerated sharing power. The consulship ended with both men still commanding their legions. Pompey received command against Mediterranean pirates in 67 BC, then against Mithridates in the east. Crassus remained in Rome accumulating wealth through real estate schemes and political manipulation. The temporary alliance dissolved, but the precedent remained. Military command led to political power, and political power secured additional military commands in a self-reinforcing cycle that traditional republican constraints couldn't interrupt. Julius Caesar observed all of this carefully. He'd served as military tribune during the Spartacus rebellion, witnessing how escaped slaves humiliated Rome's finest commanders. He'd noted how Crassus and Pompey converted military success into political dominance. The lessons were obvious to anyone paying attention. The Republic belonged to whoever commanded the most loyal legions, and loyalty came from paying soldiers better than the Senate could match. Caesar built his own political career on the Spartacus template. Military command in Gaul produced victories that generated enormous wealth through plunder and slave sales. That wealth funded bribes, games, and direct payments to soldiers, creating personal loyalty. The Gallic legions became Caesar's private army, paid from his accounts, commanded by his appointees, motivated by promises of land and bonuses that Caesar alone could deliver. The pattern Crassus had established, private funding for public military forces, reached its logical conclusion. The first triumvirate formed in 60 BC when Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar formalized their political alliance. 3 men with armies and wealth controlled Rome completely, dividing provinces and offices among themselves without Senate input. The Republic continued to exist formally. Consuls were elected, laws were passed, traditional ceremonies continued. But actual power resided with the triumvirs, and everyone knew constitutional forms had become theatre masking military dictatorship. Crassus died in 53 BC during a disastrous campaign against Parthia, trying to win military glory matching Pompey's eastern conquests and Caesar's Gallic victories. His army was annihilated at Carrhae, one of Rome's worst defeats, and Crassus himself was killed during negotiations. The triumvirate collapsed into direct rivalry between Pompey and Caesar, both commanding legions, both refusing to disband forces, both understanding that whoever blinked first would face the same crucifixion fate that had consumed Spartacus's followers. Civil war erupted in 49 BC when Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his legions rather than surrender command. The war that followed was the Spartacus rebellion's direct descendant, armies fighting for individual commanders rather than the Republic, battles decided by which general could pay troops better and promise more land grants. Pompey fled to Egypt where he was assassinated. Caesar seized control of Rome and governed as dictator until his own assassination in 44 BC. The Republic never recovered. Caesar's death triggered more civil wars as his heirs fought for supremacy. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, repeating the pattern established by their predecessors. More proscriptions, more legions fighting for individual commanders, more erosion of traditional institutions. Octavian eventually defeated all rivals and became Augustus, first emperor of Rome, formally ending the Republic in 27 BC. The transformation from Republic to Empire took exactly 44 years from the end of Spartacus's rebellion. The connection wasn't coincidental. The rebellion had demonstrated that legions could be motivated by personal loyalty rather than abstract patriotism, that generals could fund private armies, that Senate authority depended on military force it no longer monopolized. Every subsequent general learned these lessons and applied them ruthlessly. Historians would debate for centuries whether the Republic's fall was inevitable, or whether specific individuals like Caesar and Augustus caused the collapse. The question missed the underlying reality. The Republic's foundation was slave labour, and any system built on enslaving millions of people contained contradictions that would eventually destroy it. Spartacus hadn't intended to topple Rome's political system. He'd simply exposed how fragile that system was, how dependent on military force, how vulnerable to generals who understood that loyalty was purchasable. The Roman Empire that replaced the Republic expanded slavery to unprecedented scales. Augustus and his successors conquered new territories specifically to acquire slaves, built monuments with slave labour, and created economies entirely dependent on human property. The lesson of Spartacus wasn't that slavery should end. It was that slave control required overwhelming force permanently deployed. The empire became militarized police state partly to prevent any repetition of the rebellion that had nearly destroyed the Republic. But imperial expansion eventually exceeded Rome's ability to sustain itself. The constant need for slaves to maintain the economy drove military campaigns that stretched supply lines beyond supportability. Germanic tribes that Rome tried to enslave instead destroyed legions in Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, demonstrating that not all populations could be conquered and exploited. The cost of maintaining borders against people who refused enslavement gradually bankrupted the empire. Christianity spread through the empire partly by offering slaves spiritual equality with masters, something Roman religion never provided. The religion didn't initially oppose slavery institutionally. Paul's letters urged slaves to obey masters, but the theological framework undermined slavery's moral foundation. If all humans possessed immortal souls equal before God, the justification for treating people as property became increasingly difficult to maintain philosophically. The Western Empire collapsed in 476 AD, roughly 550 years after Spartacus's rebellion. The causes were complex: economic decline, military defeats, administrative incompetence, disease, climate change. But underlying all of it was a system built on extracting maximum labour from conquered populations, while providing minimal incentive for those populations to defend the system. When Germanic tribes offered better lives than Roman slavery, many slaves simply left or actively assisted invaders. Spartacus himself became a mythological figure within generations of his death. Christian martyrs referenced him as symbol of resistance against tyranny. Medieval peasant revolts invoked his name. Renaissance writers portrayed him as noble savage fighting corrupt civilization. Modern revolutionaries from Toussaint Louverture to communist movements claimed his legacy. The historical Spartacus, Thracian warrior who wanted simply to escape, vanished beneath layers of symbolism and political appropriation. The actual rebellion was brutal and ugly, not heroic crusade for justice. Spartacus's forces crucified Roman prisoners, sold captured enemies into slavery, and massacred civilians during raids. The rebellion wasn't attempting to abolish slavery as institution. Many of Spartacus's followers owned slaves themselves before being enslaved. The goal was personal freedom for specific individuals, not systemic change. Retroactive projection of abolitionist ideals onto ancient slave revolt distorted historical reality. Yet something genuine did emerge from the rebellion that transcended ancient contexts. Spartacus demonstrated that enslaved people could organize, fight, and defeat professional militaries. He proved that courage and tactical intelligence weren't properties exclusive to free citizens. He showed that systems built on mass exploitation contained vulnerabilities their architects couldn't eliminate. These lessons remained valid across centuries and cultures, which explained why authorities from Rome to modern dictatorships worked obsessively to suppress knowledge of successful slave rebellions. The Roman Empire spent substantial resources ensuring Spartacus wasn't celebrated. Official histories minimized his achievements. Laws prohibited positive references to the rebellion. Teachers who discussed the revolt emphasized Roman victory rather than rebel capabilities. The systematic suppression worked partially. Most Romans learned about Spartacus only as cautionary tale about the futility of resistance. But complete erasure proved impossible because the rebellion had been too large, too successful for too long. Gladiatorial games continued in Rome for another 4 centuries after Spartacus's death. The games became even more elaborate under the empire, involving more combatants, more exotic animals, more theatrical executions. The Colosseum opened in 80 AD with 100 days of games killing thousands of gladiators, criminals, and animals. The connection to Spartacus was never acknowledged officially. Admitting that forcing people to fight for entertainment had nearly destroyed Rome would undermine the institution's legitimacy. But everyone involved in training gladiators after 71 BC knew the story. Every lanista, every guard, every doctor who treated gladiator wounds understood that men trained to kill could turn those skills against their masters. Security at gladiatorial schools increased dramatically. Multiple guard shifts, better weapons control, severe punishments for minor infractions, all implemented because 78 men with kitchen knives had demonstrated what trained fighters could accomplish once they decided to rebel. The Appian Way remained Rome's primary southern route for centuries. Travellers continued to pass the locations where 6,000 slaves had died on crosses, though physical evidence disappeared within years. Some sections of road retain the name Via Crucis, Way of Crosses, in local vernacular, indicating how deeply the mass crucifixion imprinted on regional memory. Parents told children what had happened there, using the story to enforce obedience or inspire resistance depending on their position in Roman society. Modern archaeology has found no physical evidence of the crucifixions. Wood rotted, iron corroded, bones were either buried or scattered across surrounding fields. The lack of material confirmation hasn't prevented the event from remaining one of Rome's most documented historical incidents. Too many ancient sources reference the crucifixions for them to be literary invention. The absence of archaeological evidence simply reflects how thoroughly biological decomposition eliminates bodies given sufficient time. The fundamental question Spartacus's rebellion raised never received answer in Roman society. How do you maintain civilization built on enslaving millions without creating the military apparatus that eventually destroys constitutional government? Rome chose militarization, sacrificing republic to preserve slavery. The choice produced empire that lasted centuries but collapsed eventually under the weight of contradictions Spartacus had exposed. No society since has successfully resolved the tension between human freedom and authoritarian control, between respecting rights and maintaining order through force. Spartacus wanted freedom. He died without achieving it. His followers died by the thousands. The rebellion accomplished none of its immediate objectives. Yet 2,000 years later, his name remains symbol of resistance against oppression, while the Roman masters who killed him are remembered primarily as historical footnotes. Victory and defeat measure differently across sufficient time. The crosses won the battle. The memory won everything else. The Haitian Revolution erupted in 1791 when enslaved Africans on French sugar plantations decided they'd had enough of torture, rape, and systematic murder disguised as agricultural labour. Toussaint Louverture led the rebellion that would ultimately create the first independent Black Republic in the Americas. French colonists called him the Black Spartacus, a simultaneous insult and terrified recognition that history was repeating. The comparison was accurate. Both men understood their master's military tactics intimately. Both transformed property into armies. Both proved that enslaved people could defeat professional militaries. The Haitian rebels studied every recorded slave revolt, including Spartacus. They learned from his mistakes. Never trust pirates. Never split your forces. Never stop moving toward escape until you've actually escaped. The rebellion lasted 13 years of brutal warfare that killed hundreds of thousands. Unlike Spartacus, the Haitians won completely, driving out French forces and establishing a nation that would terrify slaveholders worldwide for generations. Napoleon sent 60,000 troops to reconquer Haiti. Yellow fever and determined resistance destroyed the expedition. France never recovered its richest colony. American slaveholders watched Haiti with pure terror. The rebellion proved that enslaved populations could organize, sustain revolutionary warfare, and establish functional governments. Southern newspapers suppressed information about Haiti, prohibited discussion of the revolution, and executed slaves caught with Haitian revolutionary literature. The censorship was Spartacus Redux. Authorities understood that knowledge of successful rebellion spread like disease through enslaved populations. Information itself became weapon requiring containment. Gabriel Prosser planned a slave revolt in Virginia in 1800 explicitly modelled on Spartacus's rebellion. Prosser was a literate blacksmith who'd read classical histories, understood Roman tactics, and recognized that Richmond's location near rivers provided strategic advantages similar to those Spartacus had exploited in Italy. He recruited hundreds of followers, stockpiled weapons, and planned coordinated attacks on armories in the governor's mansion. The rebellion failed when informants revealed the plot hours before execution. Prosser and 26 followers were hanged. Virginia responded with restrictions on slave literacy, movement, and assembly that remained law until the Civil War. Denmark Vesey organized another Spartacus-inspired revolt in Charleston in 1822. Vesey was a freed carpenter who'd purchased his freedom but remained in Charleston near family still enslaved. He studied both Spartacus and Haiti, attempting to synthesize lessons from both into a revolt that would spread across South Carolina. The plot involved thousands of potential rebels, coordinated attacks on Charleston's arsenals, and plans to sail captured ships to Haiti. Betrayal again destroyed the conspiracy before it began. Vesey and 34 others were executed. South Carolina tightened slave codes so severely that the state became essentially a police state for black residents, free or enslaved. Nat Turner finally succeeded in launching a sustained rebellion in Virginia in 1831. Turner claimed religious visions commanded the uprising, but his tactical approach mirrored Spartacus: hit quickly, seize weapons, move constantly, grow the force through liberated slaves. The rebellion killed 60 whites over 2 days before militias surrounded Turner's band. The rebels fought desperately but were overwhelmed. Turner evaded capture for 2 months before being found, tried, and hanged. Virginia's response was Spartacus-level brutality. At least 120 enslaved people were killed by mobs, and whites murdered innocent black people across the South in paranoid retaliation. Karl Marx referenced Spartacus constantly in his writings about class struggle and revolutionary violence. Marx saw the gladiator as prototype for proletarian revolutionary, member of exploited class who recognized that the system couldn't be reformed, only destroyed. Communist movements across Europe adopted Spartacus as symbol, naming organizations and uprisings after him. The Spartacist League in Germany attempted revolution in 1919, failed, and saw its leaders Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht murdered by proto-Nazi paramilitaries. The pattern held: invoke Spartacus, attempt revolution, get crushed by state violence. The Soviet Union erected statues of Spartacus throughout communist territories, portraying him as proto-communist revolutionary fighting against capitalist oppression. The historical distortion was absurd. Spartacus wanted personal freedom, not collective ownership of means of production. But symbolism mattered more than accuracy. Every authoritarian regime needed heroes from the past legitimizing present struggles. Spartacus served that purpose across wildly different ideological contexts because his core story, the powerless fighting the powerful, resonated universally. Hollywood discovered Spartacus in 1960 when Kirk Douglas produced and starred in a film that became a cultural phenomenon. The movie bore minimal resemblance to historical events. Dialogue was invented, love stories fabricated, motivations simplified into good versus evil. Stanley Kubrick directed it as Cold War allegory about individual freedom versus totalitarian control. The famous I Am Spartacus scene, where rebels claim the leader's identity to protect him, never happened historically but became the most iconic moment associated with the rebellion. Fiction had completely replaced fact. The film was actually blacklist-breaking political statement. Dalton Trumbo wrote the screenplay while officially blacklisted for communist sympathies during McCarthy-era witch hunts. Kirk Douglas giving Trumbo screen credit was deliberate challenge to Hollywood's political censorship. Spartacus became symbol for resistance to McCarthyism, representing exactly the kind of dangerous ideas the blacklist existed to suppress. The irony was perfect. Story about crushing rebellion was used to break political repression, demonstrating that symbols are infinitely malleable across different contexts. The American Civil Rights Movement invoked Spartacus as the peaceful protest escalated into urban rebellions during the late 1960s. Black Power activists saw parallels between Roman slavery and American racial oppression. Malcolm X referenced Spartacus in speeches about armed self-defense. Stokely Carmichael discussed the rebellion when explaining why nonviolence had limits. The symbolism was strategic. If enslaved gladiators could fight professional armies, modern black Americans could certainly resist local police departments. The comparison made authorities nervous for the same reasons it had made Roman senators nervous 2 millennia earlier. Prison riots in Attica in 1971 saw inmates referencing Spartacus when explaining their rebellion against brutal conditions. The prisoners understood they were property in all but formal legal status, owned by the state, forced to labour, subjected to violence without recourse. The Attica uprising ended with state police killing 29 inmates and 10 hostages, then systematically torturing survivors. The massacre was a small-scale version of Rome's response to Spartacus. Overwhelming force, exemplary brutality, clear messaging that resistance brings only death. Anti-colonial movements across Africa, Asia and Latin America adopted Spartacus as symbol during decolonization struggles. Leaders from Kwame Nkrumah to Che Guevara referenced the rebellion when discussing tactics against European powers. The parallel was obvious. Colonized populations were effectively enslaved through economic exploitation and political domination, and throwing off those chains required the same courage Spartacus had demonstrated. The successful decolonization movements proved Spartacus' core strategy was sound. Organize the exploited, attack the oppressor's weak points, sustain resistance until the cost of maintaining control exceeds the benefits. Modern labor movements still invoke Spartacus when organizing against exploitative working conditions. The symbolism works because wage slavery and chattel slavery occupy the same spectrum of human exploitation. Different degrees, same fundamental relationship of owners extracting maximum labor while providing minimum compensation. Union organizers facing violent suppression by corporate security forces or police understand experientially what Spartacus faced. The rebellion becomes template for resistance against any system that treats human beings as disposable resources. Academic historians grew uncomfortable with Spartacus' symbolic appropriation by various political movements. Scholars emphasized that the historical rebellion had no abolitionist agenda, included atrocities by rebels, and failed completely in achieving stated objectives. The academic position was technically accurate, but missed the point. Spartacus matters not because he succeeded, but because he tried. Not because he was morally pure, but because he chose resistance over submission. The historical details are genuinely important for understanding ancient Rome. The symbol matters for understanding human responses to oppression across all societies. Archaeological work in Italy during the 20th century attempted to locate physical evidence of the rebellion. Battlefield sites, crucifixion locations, gladiatorial schools. The research produced minimal results. Ancient battlefields rarely leave identifiable archaeological signatures unless accompanied by mass burials or significant material culture. Gladiatorial schools were repurposed or demolished centuries ago. The crucifixion sites along the Appian Way left no permanent traces. Spartacus exists primarily in written records, not material evidence, which makes him frustratingly resistant to modern scientific verification. The lack of physical evidence encouraged fringe theories claiming the entire rebellion was invented by later writers or massively exaggerated from minor incidents. These theories collapsed under examination. Too many contemporary sources, too many independent confirmations, too much detail for fabrication. But the theories revealed anxiety about a story where enslaved people defeated Rome repeatedly. Some scholars unconsciously preferred believing the rebellion was myth, rather than confronting its implications about Roman vulnerability and enslaved people's capabilities. Genetic studies of modern Italian populations show mixing between Mediterranean groups and Northern European populations during the late Republic period. Some researchers speculated this reflects Spartacus's army, Gauls, Germans and Thracians who settled in Italy after escaping the final battle, or who were already present but not identified after the rebellion ended. The speculation is unprovable with current technology, but it raises interesting questions about how many rebels actually survived, whether some found anonymity in Rome's vast population, and whether Spartacus's bloodline continues in modern descendants who don't know their ancestors' identity. The gladiatorial system that produced Spartacus survived until 404 AD, when Emperor Honorius banned the games after a monk named Telemachus jumped into the arena to stop a fight and was killed by the crowd. The official reason was Christian moral objection to blood sports. The practical reason was economic. The empire couldn't afford the games anymore, couldn't capture enough slaves to sustain the losses, couldn't maintain the infrastructure. Spartacus had exposed the system's vulnerabilities 4.5 centuries earlier. Christianity provided convenient excuse to abandon an institution that had become economically unsustainable. Modern sports spectacles, from boxing to mixed martial arts, are direct descendants of gladiatorial games. The comparison makes fans uncomfortable, but the parallel is undeniable. Paying to watch people injure each other for entertainment, betting on outcomes, creating celebrity fighters whose lives are controlled by promoters. The main difference is contemporary fighters aren't legally property and theoretically participate voluntarily. But economic desperation creates coercion indistinguishable from slavery for many fighters. The system remains exploitative even when decorated with contracts and legal rights. Underground fighting rings operating outside legal frameworks, human trafficking operations forcing people into fights, prison systems organising inmate combat, criminal organisations staging matches with enslaved participants are pure Spartacus territory. These operations exist worldwide, generate enormous profits, and resist elimination because wealthy spectators pay premium prices for authentic violence. The gladiator as enslaved fighter never actually disappeared. The practice just moved from public amphitheatres to private venues where authorities look the other way. Spartacus would recognise modern slavery immediately despite its different legal structures. Human trafficking moves millions of people annually into forced labour. Agriculture, construction, manufacturing, domestic service, sexual exploitation. The victims are property in everything but name, controlled through violence and debt bondage rather than chains and auction blocks. The International Labour Organization estimates 40 million people live in slavery currently, more than at any point in human history, including ancient Rome. The numbers are imprecise, but the reality is indisputable. Slavery adapted, evolved, and thrived across millennia of supposed moral progress. The fundamental question Spartacus's rebellion posed remains unanswered. What justifies one human being owning another? Every civilization that practiced slavery eventually produced sophisticated philosophical justifications: natural hierarchy, racial superiority, religious mandate, economic necessity. All of these justifications collapsed eventually, usually after violent struggles by enslaved people themselves, rather than through moral enlightenment by slaveholders. Spartacus fits this pattern. He didn't convince Romans that slavery was wrong. He forced them to acknowledge that enslaved people would fight back regardless of justifications. The rebellion proved that human dignity isn't granted by those in power. It's inherent and will be defended even at cost of death. Rome could kill Spartacus, crucify his followers, suppress information about the revolt. What Rome couldn't do was eliminate the fundamental drive toward freedom that motivated the rebellion. Every enslaved person in Roman territory knew someone had fought back successfully for 2 years. That knowledge couldn't be extracted from collective memory through any amount of violence. Modern authoritarian regimes understand this, which explains their obsessive control of historical narratives. China censors discussions of Tiananmen Square. Russia rewrites histories of Soviet-era atrocities. Various governments suppress research into their own histories of slavery, genocide, and political repression. The pattern is identical to Rome's treatment of Spartacus. Authorities recognize that knowledge of successful resistance spreads like contagion through oppressed populations. Controlling the past becomes prerequisite for controlling the present. But information always escapes eventually. Digital technology makes censorship increasingly difficult. Every attempt to suppress historical truth generates opposite effects as people search for what authorities want hidden. Spartacus survived Roman censorship through oral traditions, later historians, and sheer dramatic power of his story. Modern resistance movements will survive current censorship through similar mechanisms. The methods change, the pattern endures. The final legacy of Spartacus isn't his military victories or even his rebellion's ultimate failure. It's the demonstration that people will risk everything for freedom regardless of odds. That systems built on exploitation contain self-destructive contradictions, and that symbols of resistance outlive the empires that created the conditions requiring resistance. Rome is gone. Spartacus remains. That inversion of expected outcome says everything about power's limits and human spirit's durability. 2,000 years separate modern readers from the gladiator who escaped a training school with 77 followers. The historical distance should make Spartacus irrelevant, ancient figure from vanished civilization, fighting over issues supposedly resolved. But every generation rediscovers him, reinterprets his struggle, and finds contemporary relevance. As long as humans oppress other humans, Spartacus will matter. As long as people resist that oppression, his story will resonate. The crosses along the Appian Way rotted away millennia ago. The memory they tried to instill, that resistance is futile, failed completely. Spartacus won after all, just not in ways Romans could have imagined or ways he could have survived to witness. 5,000 rebels escaped the final battle at the Silurus River through sheer chaos and Roman focus on Spartacus's main force. These weren't the organised units that had fought so effectively for 2 years. They were panicked survivors running in whatever direction appeared safest. Roman cavalry pursued most of them, cutting down fleeing slaves within hours, but some disappeared into forests, mountains, and the vast networks of caves honeycombing southern Italy. Rome never found them all. The escaped rebels faced impossible choices in hostile territory, where every civilian viewed them as property to be returned or threats to be eliminated. They couldn't approach towns without risking capture. Farms meant potential food, but also potential informants who'd alert authorities for reward money. The rebellion had spent 2 years teaching Italian civilians that reporting escaped slaves brought profit and safety. Those lessons didn't evaporate with Spartacus's defeat. Some survivors tried reaching their homelands individually, abandoning the collective safety that had sustained them during the rebellion. Gauls headed north toward the Alps, hoping to cross mountains into territories Rome didn't fully control. Germans aimed for the Rhine frontier where tribal lands offered potential sanctuary. Thracians faced the longest journeys, back across the Adriatic, through hostile Macedonian territories, into mountain regions they'd left years or decades earlier. Most died attempting these journeys, killed by elements, starvation, or locals who viewed them as bandits. A handful made it. Fragmentary records from Gallic tribes mention warriors returning from Italian captivity around 70 BC, with stories of fighting Romans and serving a Thracian commander. Germanic tribal histories contain similar references, though oral traditions make verification impossible. These survivors would have been traumatized, physically scarred, and carrying knowledge of Roman military tactics that tribal warriors could exploit in future conflicts. They became seeds of resistance planted in territories Rome would struggle to conquer for centuries. Others chose different survival strategies entirely. Some rebels hid in plain sight, taking new identities in cities where urban anonymity protected them. Rome's population exceeded 1 million by the late Republic, fed by constant influx of slaves, freedmen, immigrants, and refugees. A former gladiator who kept his mouth shut, found manual labour, and avoided attention could potentially disappear into this mass. No identification documents existed, no comprehensive census tracked individuals, no photographs or fingerprints enabled recognition across time. The risk was enormous. Anyone who'd fought in Spartacus's army bore distinguishing marks, gladiator brands, scars from specific weapons, tattoos marking their origins. Informants could recognize these marks and report suspects for reward money that exceeded yearly wages for most Romans. Former rebels needed to hide visible scars, invent plausible histories explaining brands, and suppress any hint of military training that might reveal their pasts. One mistake meant crucifixion. Female survivors faced particular horrors. Women had accompanied the rebellion as fighters, cooks, healers, and family members. After the defeat, any woman associated with the rebels became property again, claimed by Roman soldiers as spoils of war, sold to brothels, or returned to original masters if identified. The historical record is nearly silent on their fates, which itself tells the story. Women in ancient warfare were either invisible to historians or considered too degraded by association with defeated enemies to merit documentation. Some women survived through desperate expedients. Pregnancy offered temporary protection since pregnant slaves had market value for their unborn children. Others formed relationships with Roman soldiers, trading sexual access for survival, a transaction as old as warfare itself. The most resourceful might have stolen identities of free women, forged manumission documents, or fled to regions where their past couldn't be traced. These strategies required resources, luck, and willingness to abandon everyone they'd fought alongside. Children born during the rebellion faced automatic enslavement, regardless of their parents' fates. Roman law dictated that children inherited their mother's legal status. If she was enslaved, her children were property from birth. Babies born in Spartacus's camps were either captured during the final battle or abandoned during the chaotic retreat. Most died. Those who survived were sold individually to separate buyers, ensuring they'd never learn their origins or connect with siblings. Rome was systematic about destroying rebel families, but some children survived and grew to adulthood ignorant of their heritage. A child born in 72 BC during the rebellion would be 30 years old when Augustus founded the empire. That person might have lived an entire life as slave or freedman, never knowing their parents had fought Romans for 2 years. The rebellion's genetic legacy continued through descendants who had no knowledge of their ancestors' resistance. Blood memory doesn't transmit through DNA, but physical characteristics do, and somewhere in Italy, people living today might carry genes from Spartacus's army. Escaped rebels who remained in Italy faced constant threat of recognition. The gladiatorial games continued across the peninsula, and any trainer or guard from the Ludus system could potentially identify former fighters. Spartacus's rebels had become famous. Their fighting styles were discussed, their tactics analysed, their leaders described in detail by historians. Fame was curse when trying to disappear. The most successful survivors would have been anonymous followers, not the celebrated gladiators whose names appeared in contemporary accounts. One survival strategy involved joining Rome's legions under false identities. The military recruited constantly, asked few questions about origins, and offered anonymity within massive soldiers. A former rebel with military training would be a valuable recruit, and legion service provided steady food, shelter, and eventually citizenship after discharge. The irony was perfect. Slaves who'd fought against Rome might have ended up fighting for Rome, using skills learned in rebellion to conquer new territories for the empire that had enslaved them. This happened. Roman military records are incomplete, but scattered references mention auxiliary soldiers from Gaul and Germania who'd previously served elsewhere and demonstrated unusual familiarity with Roman tactics. Some historians interpret these references as former rebels who joined legions after the revolt. The evidence is circumstantial but plausible. Survival required pragmatism, and fighting for Rome beat crucifixion or starvation. Moral considerations were luxuries that desperate people couldn't afford. The psychological toll on survivors must have been catastrophic. They'd experienced 2 years of freedom, tasted victory over professional armies, believed escape was possible. Then they'd watched everything collapse, seen comrades crucified, faced the reality that rebellion had accomplished nothing except getting most participants killed. Survivor guilt combines with PTSD in ways that destroy mental stability. Some rebels probably sought death deliberately rather than live with memories of what they'd lost. Others carried rage that never diminished. These survivors would have been dangerous, trained killers, motivated by hatred, familiar with Roman weaknesses. If they avoided capture and maintained their anger, they could have spent decades sabotaging estates, assassinating slave owners, and generally making Roman authority precarious in rural areas. Banditry increased across Italy after the Spartacus revolt, though records don't distinguish between common criminals and former rebels conducting guerrilla warfare. The Cilician pirates who'd betrayed Spartacus faced their own reckoning within years. Pompey received extraordinary command to clear the Mediterranean of piracy in 67 BC, just 4 years after the slave revolt ended. His campaign destroyed pirate strongholds systematically, captured hundreds of ships, and either executed or enslaved thousands of pirates. The betrayal that had trapped Spartacus in Brutium earned the Cilicians no protection from Roman vengeance. They'd taken Spartacus's gold and abandoned him to die. Rome took their ships and crucified them anyway. Some former rebels apparently made it to Parthia, Rome's great eastern rival. Parthian records mention European fighters appearing in their armies during the 60s BC with knowledge of Roman tactics. These could have been deserters from Roman legions, mercenaries, or possibly Spartacus's survivors seeking revenge by training Rome's enemies. The Battle of Cannae in 53 BC, where Parthians destroyed Crassus's army, might have involved veterans of the slave rebellion teaching Parthians how to defeat Roman formations. The symmetry would be poetic. The general who'd crushed Spartacus, killed by tactics developed during the rebellion he'd suppressed. Crassus's death at Cannae included details suggesting former rebels might have been present. The Parthians reportedly poured molten gold down Crassus's throat after capturing him, symbolizing his infamous greed. This wasn't standard Parthian execution method. It was theatrical revenge someone had specifically planned. Who better to design such punishment than survivors of the army Crassus had decimated? People who'd watched him build a 40-mile wall to starve them. People who had seen 6,000 comrades crucified along a road to satisfy his ambition. The gladiator schools reopened after the rebellion with security measures that made Spartacus's escape impossible to repeat. Multiple layers of guards, weapons locked in rooms requiring multiple keys held by different people, fighters kept in individual cells at night, informant networks paying slaves to report suspicious conversations. The Ludus system became prison architecture that later inspired modern penitentiaries. Every security measure existed because 78 men had once used kitchen knives to start a war. New gladiators entering the system after 71 BC trained under shadow of Spartacus's legend. Trainers used him as cautionary tale. See what happens when slaves forget their place. See how rebellion ends. See the crosses waiting for those who think freedom is possible. But the story cut both ways. Young fighters also heard that Spartacus had defeated 9 Roman armies, that he'd turned slaves into soldiers, that he'd made Rome tremble for 2 years. The warning contained inspiration that authorities couldn't eliminate no matter how carefully they framed the narrative. Minor revolts continued erupting across the empire for centuries, most quickly suppressed, but all demonstrating that Spartacus's example remained infectious. Slaves in Sicily rebelled in 139–132 BC, and again in 104–100 BC, both times creating armies that lasted years before Rome crushed them. These earlier rebellions had influenced Spartacus, and his rebellion influenced every subsequent slave uprising. The cycle of revolt and suppression repeated endlessly because the fundamental injustice of slavery guaranteed continuous resistance, regardless of how brutally authorities punished previous rebels. The survivors who disappeared completely, those who managed to hide, escape, or blend into civilian populations, became the rebellion's truest victors. They didn't achieve the freedom Spartacus promised, didn't reach homelands beyond Rome's reach, didn't overthrow their oppressors, but they lived. They survived when Rome wanted them dead. They denied Rome the satisfaction of total victory. In wars of annihilation, mere survival constitutes success. Descendants of these survivors spread across Europe. Their ancestry lost to history, but their existence undeniable. Statistical genetics suggests thousands of people alive today carry genetic markers from soldiers and slaves who lived during the Roman Republic. Some portion of those markers came from Spartacus's army, not from the gladiator himself necessarily, but from the 100,000 followers who joined his cause. Their DNA survived even though their names disappeared. The Roman families who'd lost members to the rebellion carried their own trauma across generations. Sons grew up knowing their fathers had died fighting slaves. Daughters learned their mothers had been killed during rebel raids. The humiliation of defeat by property was passed down as family shame, creating multi-generational hatred toward any sign of slave resistance. These families became the most enthusiastic supporters of extreme measures against suspected rebels, ensuring Rome's slave control systems grew ever more brutal. But somewhere in Italy, descendants of rebels and descendants of slaveholders eventually intermarried. The genetic mixing was inevitable across centuries of history. People whose ancestors had fought on opposite sides of the rebellion's battles eventually produced children together, completely unaware of the historical ironies. The war that had seemed so absolute in 71 BC dissolved into the genetic melting pot of Mediterranean populations, leaving no pure lineages from either side. The last person who remembered the rebellion personally died probably around 10 AD, roughly 80 years after the final battle. Someone enslaved as a young child during the revolt might have lived that long. This person would have carried memories of camps on Vesuvius, of marches across Italy, of seeing Spartacus leading the army. Then they watched those memories become stories, watched stories become legends, watched legends get distorted into propaganda or inspiration depending on who told them. Living memory became history, and history became myth. Archaeological evidence of the individual survivors will never be found. They left no monuments, no inscriptions, no material culture distinguishing them from millions of other anonymous people in the Roman Empire. Their graves are unmarked if they received graves at all. Their possessions were worthless and have long since deteriorated. They exist only in the statistical certainty that some percentage must have escaped detection, survived, and continued living in the empire that had tried to kill them. These invisible survivors are the rebellion's secret victory, the proof that Rome's power had limits, that total control was impossible even for history's most effective authoritarian state. Every survivor represented a crack in Roman authority, evidence that comprehensive surveillance and brutal punishment couldn't eliminate resistance completely. The survivors didn't need to organize or fight again. Their simple existence undermined Rome's claims of absolute power. The greatest irony is that by suppressing information about survivors, Rome made them invisible to historians, but also impossible to eliminate. If authorities don't know someone survived, they can't hunt that person. The survivors who thrived were those Rome forgot to look for. The anonymous, the unremarkable, the people who became nobody in particular, and therefore beyond persecution. Obscurity saved them when fame would have killed them. Spartacus's body was never found, never confirmed, never displayed. Some of his followers vanished just as completely. The rebellion ended officially when Crassus crucified 6,000 prisoners, but endings are cleaner in official records than in reality. Wars don't terminate neatly. They fade gradually as participants die or disappear, as survivors scatter and hide, as the defeated become invisible rather than eliminated. The Third Servile War ended for Rome in 71 BC. For survivors living under assumed identities decades later, it never quite ended at all. The economic damage from Spartacus's rebellion exceeded Rome's losses in most foreign wars. 2 years of systematic state destruction across southern Italy had eliminated harvests, killed livestock, burned infrastructure, and depopulated entire agricultural regions. The financial impact rippled through Rome's economy for a generation, driving grain prices to levels that sparked food riots in the capital. Wealthy landowners who'd built fortunes on plantation slavery found themselves bankrupt when their primary assets, human property, either joined the rebellion or were killed during suppression efforts. Insurance didn't exist in ancient Rome, meaning estate owners absorbed total losses without compensation. A senator who owned 500 slaves might wake to find all of them fled, his villa burned, and his olive groves destroyed. Rebuilding required capital most owners didn't possess after losing their labour force and productive capacity simultaneously. Banking houses foreclosed on properties across Campania and Lucania, creating a real estate collapse that allowed wealthy buyers like Crassus to acquire vast territories at minimal cost. Crassus built his fortune primarily through purchasing burning buildings in Rome at a fraction of their value, then extinguishing the fires with his private fire brigade. The Spartacus rebellion gave him similar opportunities on massive scale. He bought dozens of devastated estates for essentially nothing, imported new slaves at war-depressed prices, and rebuilt agricultural operations using his existing capital reserves. The rebellion that had threatened his life ultimately doubled his wealth, making him richer than many client kingdoms. The slave market crashed immediately after the rebellion, then exploded to unprecedented prices within months. The initial crash came from panic selling. Owners throughout Italy liquidated property fearing slave revolts would spread. Then reality hit that Rome's economy couldn't function without slaves, and the rebellion had killed over 100,000 of them. Supply collapsed while demand remained constant, driving prices for healthy young slaves to levels that made human trafficking extraordinarily profitable for anyone willing to engage in it. Roman military campaigns intensified across Mediterranean territories, specifically to acquire replacement slaves for Italian markets. Pompey's eastern campaigns enslaved hundreds of thousands. Caesar's Gallic conquest generated slave shipments so vast they temporarily crashed prices again through oversupply. The military expansion that characterized the late Republic was partly driven by need to replace slave populations lost during the Spartacus revolt. Empire building became slave raiding on industrial scale, justified through civilizing rhetoric but motivated by economic necessity. The demographic impact on Italy was catastrophic and permanent. The peninsula's population had been roughly 6 million people in 73 BC, with slaves comprising perhaps 30% of that total. The rebellion and its suppression killed over 150,000 people, combatants, crucified prisoners, civilian casualties. That represented over 2% of Italy's total population dying violently within 3 years. Modern equivalent would be the United States losing 7 million people to internal conflict. Rural areas suffered worst. Southern Italian agriculture depended almost entirely on slave labour for large estates. The rebellion had concentrated in exactly those regions, draining the workforce and destroying infrastructure. Some areas never recovered fully. Archaeological surveys show villa sites abandoned after the 70s BC that were never reoccupied during the Empire. The economic geography of Italy shifted permanently as agricultural production moved to provinces where slave control seemed more reliable. Sicily became primary grain supplier for Rome after the rebellion, despite having endured 2 previous slave wars that should have made Romans cautious about concentrating slave populations there. The decision reflected desperation rather than strategy. Italy couldn't feed itself anymore, and Sicily offered the nearest alternative regardless of risks. The island's population became overwhelmingly enslaved, creating exactly the conditions that had produced earlier rebellions. Rome learned nothing from Spartacus except that slavery was too profitable to abandon regardless of dangers. The psychological trauma on Rome's slave-owning class manifested in paranoid legislation restricting slave activities. New laws prohibited slaves from gathering in groups exceeding 3 people without supervision. Possession of weapons by slaves became capital crime. Testimony by slaves was only accepted under torture, formalizing assumption that enslaved people would lie unless physically coerced. The legal system evolved into apparatus for preemptive terror, attempting to prevent future rebellions through constant intimidation. Slaves responded by developing sophisticated resistance networks that operated invisibly beneath Roman attention. Work slowdowns that couldn't be attributed to individuals, tools that mysteriously broke, fires that started accidentally with suspicious frequency, poisoning of masters that resembled natural illness. The rebellion taught slaves that open revolt led to mass crucifixion, but careful sabotage could continue indefinitely if properly concealed. Roman estates became battlegrounds for undeclared wars where masters never knew who actually obeyed versus who merely performed obedience. The gladiatorial system underwent permanent reformation after Spartacus. Lanistae faced new regulations limiting how many fighters they could train simultaneously, preventing accumulation of large forces in single locations. Gladiators were rotated between schools to prevent bonding into cohesive units. Training was monitored by government inspectors checking for signs of coordination beyond immediate combat skills. The industry survived, but under surveillance state conditions that treated every fighter as potential rebel. Professional soldiers who'd fought Spartacus carried permanent psychological damage from the experience. These men had been trained to believe Roman military superiority was absolute, that discipline and formations made legions invincible against any barbarian horde. Then slaves with improvised weapons had destroyed 9 Roman armies, using tactics the slaves had learned while serving those same armies. The contradiction was existentially threatening. If slaves could fight this effectively, what did that say about the fundamental assumptions underlying Roman society? Veterans self-medicated with wine, became violent toward their own slaves, or simply refused to discuss the war. The Roman military culture valued stoicism, creating no framework for processing trauma from defeats that challenged core identity. These damaged soldiers spread throughout the empire's legions, carrying unresolved psychological wounds into subsequent campaigns. Some historians suggest the brutality of later Roman military actions, particularly in Gaul and Germania, reflected trauma responses by soldiers proving they weren't weak despite losing to slaves. The Senate commissioned official histories that minimized Spartacus's achievements while maximizing Crassus's brilliance. These accounts portrayed the rebellion as lucky criminals briefly succeeding through Roman complacency, then being crushed once serious commanders took charge. The narrative was propaganda designed to restore Roman prestige, but even propaganda revealed truth through what it tried hardest to conceal. The extensive justifications for why 9 armies lost to slaves indicated how profoundly the defeats had shaken Roman confidence. Philosophical schools debated slavery's morality with new urgency after the rebellion. Stoics argued that internal freedom mattered more than physical bondage, creating philosophical framework that justified slavery while acknowledging enslaved people's humanity. Epicureans generally avoided the question, focusing on personal happiness in ways that implicitly accepted slavery as unfortunate necessity. The debates never threatened slavery as institution. Philosophers who own slaves rarely conclude that owning slaves is wrong, but they revealed discomfort with a system that hadn't existed before Spartacus. Women's experiences during and after the rebellion vanished almost entirely from historical record. Ancient historians were men writing for male audiences, and women's perspectives were considered irrelevant unless directly affecting male political narratives. But women comprise a significant portion of the rebellion's followers. Conservative estimates suggest 20,000 to 30,000 women travelled with the army. Their stories of survival, trauma, and resistance died with them, leaving silence where voices should be. Reconstructing women's experiences requires reading between lines of sources that mention them only peripherally. References to camp followers meant women and children accompanying the army. Reports of plundered estates included unspoken reality that women were raped during raids. The crucifixions included women. Roman law didn't exempt anyone from standard execution for rebellious slaves. These fragments suggest horror that male historians deemed too ordinary to document because violence against enslaved women was ubiquitous background noise in Roman society. Children born in Spartacus's camps faced the cruelest fates. Roman law was explicit. Children of enslaved mothers were property from birth regardless of father's status. Babies captured after the final battle were separated from mothers and sold individually, maximizing profits while destroying any possibility of family units forming. These children grew up not knowing their origins, raised as slaves who'd been slaves since birth, with no memory of the 2 years their parents had lived free. Some of these children became gladiators themselves, training in the same schools their parents had escaped from. The cycle was perfect and terrible. Property produces property, gladiators produce gladiators. The system perpetuates through biological reproduction of its victims. A son of Spartacus's rebellion dying in an arena 30 years later would have no idea he was reenacting his parents' lives, no sense of the historical ironies crushing him. The Romans would have seen only a barbarian dying appropriately for crowd entertainment. Medical knowledge advanced through treating wounds inflicted during the rebellion and its suppression. Roman military doctors gained extensive experience with sword cuts, spear punctures, and crush injuries from close combat. Galen, the empire's most influential physician, began his career treating wounded gladiators and developed anatomical knowledge through studying their injuries. The rebellion literally produced the medical expertise that would sustain Roman military medicine for centuries. Spartacus's warriors became involuntary research subjects whose suffering advanced science. Crucifixion as execution method spread throughout the empire after Rome demonstrated its effectiveness during the rebellion. The technique was ancient. Persians and Carthaginians had used it for centuries, but Rome refined it into systematic deterrent. The 6,000 crosses along the Appian Way proved that mass crucifixion could be organized logistically, executed efficiently, and maintained as continuous spectacle. Later emperors applied these lessons, crucifying thousands of Christians, Jewish rebels, and criminals as standard policy. The Jesus crucifixion story that would dominate Western civilization occurred roughly 60 years after Spartacus's defeat. The methods were identical: scourging, forced to carry crossbeam, nailed to wood, left to asphyxiate slowly. When Romans crucified Jesus, they were using execution procedure that had been perfected on Spartacus's followers. Early Christians knew this parallel. Some writings explicitly compared Jesus to Spartacus, both innocent men killed by Roman state power, both whose deaths supposedly redeemed others. The theological interpretations differed radically, but the physical suffering was the same. Roman Christianity would eventually condemn gladiatorial games and work toward eliminating slavery, though both processes took centuries and remained incomplete. The moral framework Christianity introduced, that all humans possess souls of equal value before God, directly contradicted slavery's premise that some people were inherently inferior property. But Christian leaders owned slaves for centuries, while developing theological justifications for why spiritual equality didn't require physical freedom. Spartacus had died fighting for immediate material freedom. Christians promised spiritual freedom after death. The difference mattered enormously to people currently enslaved. The rebellion's financial cost to the Roman state exceeded 30 million sesterces in direct military expenses, not counting economic damage to private estates. That sum represented roughly 3% of the entire republic's annual revenue, equivalent to funding 2 years of provincial government or building 50 miles of major roads. Crassus had funded much of this himself, then recouped costs through purchasing destroyed estates cheaply. The rebellion functioned as massive wealth transfer from small estate owners to Rome's richest citizen. Tax increases necessitated by rebellion costs fell disproportionately on provinces, creating resentment that would fuel later independence movements. Conquered territories were being taxed to pay for suppressing slave rebellions that only benefited Italian landowners. The injustice was obvious to provincial populations, though complaining invited military retaliation. The economic structure binding the empire together began fracturing during the late Republic, partly because rebellion costs were distributed in ways that penalized provinces while protecting Roman elite interests. Slave traders became extraordinarily wealthy in the rebellion's aftermath. The market premium for slaves who were young, healthy, and critically from regions without histories of rebellion created new trafficking patterns. North African slaves commanded higher prices than Gauls because Africa had no Spartacus equivalent. Syrian and Egyptian slaves were preferred over Germanic because Romans believed Mediterranean peoples were more docile. The market incentivized trafficking from specific regions, redirecting human misery according to price signals. The increased demand for slaves made piracy and kidnapping more profitable than legitimate trade. Mediterranean pirates who'd betrayed Spartacus continued raiding coastal cities for captives to sell in Italian markets. Inland populations faced kidnapping by organized criminals who specialized in capturing free people and forging slave documentation. Julius Caesar himself was captured by pirates as a young man. He was fortunate enough to be recognized and ransomed rather than sold as slave. Thousands of others weren't so lucky. Border regions became hunting grounds for slavers who didn't distinguish between enemy combatants and civilians. Roman military campaigns increasingly focused on capturing populations rather than controlling territory. The shift from conquest for strategic purposes to conquest for acquiring human property degraded military effectiveness. Armies optimized for taking prisoners fought differently than armies optimized for winning battles. Some military disasters resulted directly from commanders prioritizing slave capture over tactical objectives. The social fabric of Roman Italy never fully recovered from the demographic catastrophe. The replacement slaves came from different ethnic groups with different languages and cultural practices than the established slave population. This diversity was deliberate. Romans believed that preventing slaves from communicating easily would reduce rebellion risks. But it also made estate management harder and reduced economic efficiency as coordination became more difficult. Class tensions between wealthy landowners and small farmers intensified after the rebellion. The land consolidation that followed estate destruction created enormous plantations owned by senators like Crassus, while independent farmers lost properties they couldn't rebuild without capital. The free population of Italy declined as citizens couldn't compete economically with slave labor. This process, concentration of land ownership and displacement of free farmers, would eventually undermine Rome's military recruitment since legions traditionally drew soldiers from landowning citizen farmers. The military recruitment crisis accelerated Rome's shift toward professional army, loyal to generals rather than the Republic. As citizen farmers disappeared, the legions increasingly comprised landless proletarians serving for pay and land grants their commanders promised. These soldiers fought for personal benefit rather than patriotic duty, making them available for civil wars once generals decided to pursue political power through force. The constitutional crisis that destroyed the Republic traced directly to social changes triggered by the slave rebellion's economic aftermath. Spartacus had wanted simple escape. Instead, his rebellion triggered cascading consequences that reshaped Roman society across generations. The immediate military defeat was complete, but the long-term impact was revolutionary in ways neither Spartacus nor his enemies could have predicted. The crosses rotted away. The system they defended collapsed eventually under weight of contradictions the rebellion had exposed. History's verdict rendered over centuries contradicted the immediate outcome rendered in blood. The rebellions never stopped. Rome spent the next 4 centuries crushing slave uprisings across every territory it controlled, each revolt referencing Spartacus implicitly or explicitly. The pattern became predictable. Economic crisis or military distraction would create opportunity. Enslaved populations would organize. Brief success would inspire wider participation. Then overwhelming force would destroy the rebels with exemplary brutality. The cycle repeated because the underlying injustice never changed, only the specific circumstances triggering each explosion. Bulla Felix led a different kind of rebellion in 205-207 AD under Emperor Septimius Severus. Felix was a freedman who organized escaped slaves and dispossessed farmers into a guerrilla army that controlled parts of Italy for 2 years. His tactics were pure Spartacus: hit Roman supply columns, avoid pitched battles, use terrain advantages, recruit from the desperate. Felix added innovation by establishing a parallel government in territory he controlled, issuing his own edicts and collecting taxes. Rome eventually captured him through betrayal, the eternal weakness of rebellions built on trust. The Bagodai uprisings in Gaul during the 3rd century AD represented Spartacus-style revolts on massive scale. Dispossessed peasants, escaped slaves, and deserting soldiers formed armies that controlled entire provinces for years. They weren't trying to overthrow Rome. They wanted autonomy from taxation and military conscription that were destroying rural populations. Rome called them bandits and rebels. They called themselves free people, refusing to be property of an empire that gave them nothing but demands. The semantic difference mattered legally, but not practically. Both sides used the same violence. These uprisings intensified as the empire weakened during the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years of civil wars, economic collapse, plague, and foreign invasions created conditions where central authority barely functioned outside major cities. Rural areas effectively governed themselves, and governing themselves often meant armed resistance to tax collectors and military recruiters. The empire responded with mobile field armies that crushed rebellions in one province, while new ones erupted elsewhere. Rome was playing whack-a-mole with its own population. The Gothic wars of the 4th century showed what happened when enslaved populations found external allies. Gothic tribes entering the empire included thousands of escaped Roman slaves who'd fled across the frontier. These slaves knew Roman tactics, spoke Latin, and guided Gothic armies toward vulnerable targets. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, where Goths killed Emperor Valens and destroyed 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army, was partly engineered by former slaves providing intelligence. Spartacus had tried to escape north. These slaves brought the north into Rome. The person who finally achieved what Spartacus attempted wasn't a slave at all, but a barbarian general named Alaric who sacked Rome in 410 AD. His Gothic army included substantial numbers of escaped slaves and gladiators who joined specifically for revenge against masters. When Goths broke into the city, these former slaves guided them to specific estates and temples, settling personal scores that had accumulated across lifetimes of brutality. The sack lasted 3 days. The slaves made them count. The Western Empire's collapse in 476 AD ended Roman slavery's legal framework, but didn't end slavery itself. The institution evolved into serfdom under Germanic kingdoms, changing terminology without fundamentally altering the relationship where most people were bound to land and masters. Medieval Europe preserved essential aspects of Roman slavery: hereditary servitude, legal inability to move freely, obligation to labor without compensation, while developing new theological justifications for permanent underclasses. The Romans were gone. Their social structure remained. The Byzantine Empire continued Roman slavery for another 1,000 years in the east, finally ending only when Ottoman conquest destroyed the Byzantine state in 1453 AD. Throughout this period, slave revolts erupted periodically, each crushed with efficiency learned from Roman precedents. The Byzantines studied Spartacus as military history, analysing what had gone wrong from Rome's perspective and implementing preventative measures. Security procedures at Constantinople's slave markets reflected lessons from Capua's ludus: maximum surveillance, minimum opportunity for coordination. Islamic expansion across the Mediterranean created new slave systems that dwarfed anything Rome achieved. The trans-Saharan slave trade and Indian Ocean slave routes moved millions of people across centuries, creating economies where human property was the primary commodity. These systems produced their own rebellions. The Zanj rebellion in 869-883 AD saw 500,000 enslaved Africans fight the Abbasid Caliphate for 14 years in a conflict that nearly destroyed Baghdad. The tactics were familiar: escaped slaves forming armies, defeating professional forces, controlling territory. The outcome was also familiar: eventual suppression through overwhelming force and systematic killing of survivors. European colonial expansion globalized slavery on unprecedented scale. The Atlantic slave trade moved 12 million Africans to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries, creating slave societies where the majority of populations were property. These societies lived in permanent fear of rebellion because the math was obvious. Enslaved people vastly outnumbered free people in Caribbean colonies and parts of South America. Every master knew Spartacus might be among their property, and every slave knew Spartacus had at least tried to escape. Haiti finally achieved what Spartacus couldn't: total victory. The Haitian Revolution lasted from 1791 to 1804, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and ended with complete independence and the permanent abolition of slavery. The revolution succeeded partly because it learned from every failed slave revolt in recorded history. The Haitians didn't trust outside allies, didn't split their forces, didn't stop fighting until victory was absolute. They studied Spartacus. They didn't repeat his mistakes. The Haitian example terrified slave-owning societies worldwide. If enslaved Africans could destroy the richest European colony in the Americas and establish an independent nation, similar rebellions might succeed elsewhere. The fear drove increasingly brutal control measures. American slave states banned literacy, prohibited slaves from gathering without white supervision, and created slave patrols that were proto-police forces. The security apparatus existed because owners understood their slaves were potential enemies who would rebel if given opportunity. American slavery produced constant small-scale resistance and several major rebellion attempts. Gabriel Prosser in 1800, Denmark Vesey in 1822, Nat Turner in 1831. Each planned Spartacus-style revolts involving hundreds or thousands of participants. All were betrayed before achieving critical mass or crushed quickly after beginning. The failures weren't due to tactical incompetence, but to overwhelming force advantages that modern states possessed. Spartacus faced legions with swords and spears. American rebels faced artillery, telegraphs, and railway-transported reinforcements. Technology had tipped the balance decisively towards states. But technology worked both ways eventually. The telegraph that helped suppress rebellions also spread abolitionist ideas rapidly. Photographs of whipped slaves circulated globally, creating anti-slavery sentiment that economic interests couldn't fully counter. The printing press mass-produced abolitionist literature faster than authorities could confiscate it. Industrial capitalism made slavery less economically efficient than wage labor in many industries. The system that had survived millennia finally collapsed during the 19th century, partly because technological and economic changes undermined the conditions enabling it. The American Civil War was Spartacus's rebellion replayed with industrial weapons. 4 million enslaved people saw the conflict as opportunity for freedom. exactly as Spartacus's rebellion had attracted slaves from across southern Italy. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers fought in Union armies, using military training to destroy the system that had enslaved them. The war killed over 600,000 people, proportionally equivalent to 6 million deaths in the current US population, and ended with slavery's legal abolition. The crosses along the Appian Way had been replaced by battlefield cemeteries, but the underlying conflict was identical. Yet abolition didn't end the fundamental relationship. Sharecropping and convict leasing in the American South created slavery-equivalent conditions for decades after 1865. Prison labor still functions as legalized slavery in many countries, including the United States, where the 13th Amendment specifically permits involuntary servitude as criminal punishment. The system adapted, finding new legal frameworks to maintain forced labor without technically calling it slavery. Spartacus wouldn't be confused by the semantic distinctions. He'd recognize the reality of people forced to work without freedom, regardless of what laws called the arrangement. Modern human trafficking exceeds ancient slavery in absolute numbers, despite representing a smaller percentage of global population. 40 million people in various forms of slavery currently, sex trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, child soldiers, means more enslaved individuals exist now than at any point in history. The International Labour Organization documents this clinically. The numbers are conservative estimates. Actual totals likely exceed 50 million. Spartacus's fight continues in sweatshops, brothels, fishing boats, mines, and agricultural operations across every continent. The legal frameworks changed, but the economic incentives remain. Slavery persists because it's profitable, because people who profit from it have resources to prevent enforcement of laws against it, because consumers benefit from cheap goods produced by forced labor. Modern supply chains obscure the slavery, just as Roman citizens ignored how their grain got harvested and their tunics got woven. Willful ignorance is the system's most effective defense, then and now. Enforcement remains the critical failure point. International laws against human trafficking exist comprehensively. Most countries have statutes criminalizing slavery. But investigation requires resources, prosecutions require political will, and convictions require legal systems that function. These requirements aren't met in most jurisdictions most of the time. The laws are performances without substance, allowing governments to claim they oppose slavery while doing minimal actual work to stop it. Rome also had laws against mistreating slaves. The laws meant nothing when enforcement was optional. Some modern slavery operates through debt bondage that makes escape practically impossible even without physical chains. Workers are loaned money for transportation or housing, charged exorbitant interest and never able to repay the debt. They're theoretically free to leave but practically trapped, because leaving means abandoning families held as collateral or facing criminal charges for breach of contract. The system is Spartacus's world with extra steps. People who can't leave, can't resist, can't access legal protection, working until they die while owners profit. NGOs working against human trafficking face the same challenges Spartacus did: insufficient resources, powerful enemies, and populations too desperate or defeated to resist. Rescue operations sometimes succeed in liberating individuals, but the traffickers simply acquire new victims because the economic incentives haven't changed. Fighting slavery one case at a time is like bailing water from a boat with a hole in it. You might save individuals, but the boat's still sinking. Systemic solutions require eliminating the economic conditions that make slavery profitable. That means consumers paying true costs for goods currently produced by slaves, businesses accepting lower profit margins, and governments enforcing labor protections even when economically inconvenient. These changes face the same resistance they've always faced. People who benefit from the current system will fight desperately to preserve it. Every historical abolition movement succeeded only after prolonged struggle against violent opposition from those whose wealth depended on slavery. The modern abolition movement has advantages Spartacus lacked. Global communication networks spread information instantaneously. International law creates frameworks for prosecution across borders. DNA testing and digital forensics make trafficking harder to conceal. Economic development creates alternatives to slavery in regions where poverty previously made it seem inevitable. These advantages are real and meaningful. They haven't been sufficient to end slavery because advantages are meeting determined opposition from people making enormous profits. Technology also enables surveillance and control that would have amazed Roman slave owners. GPS tracking of migrant workers, digital monitoring of prostituted people, algorithmic systems flagging escape attempts. Modern slavery incorporates sophisticated technology, making resistance harder. The tools that could liberate people are being used to enslave them more efficiently. Spartacus fought guards with swords. Modern slaves face biometric identification systems and international law enforcement coordination, making escape orders of magnitude harder. But human desire for freedom remains constant across millennia. Every trafficked person is a potential Spartacus, every forced labourer a potential rebel. The rebellions continue in different forms: escaped victims testifying against traffickers, journalists exposing supply chains, activists pressuring corporations, prosecutors pursuing cases despite political obstacles. The struggle is less dramatic than ancient battles, more bureaucratic and legal. The fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. Enslaved people want freedom. Masters want property. The conflict is permanent until one side wins decisively. History suggests pessimistic conclusions. Slavery has existed for as long as written records document human civilization. Every major society practiced it. Every religion initially justified it. Every economic system incorporated it. The institution adapted to legal prohibitions, evolved new forms when old ones were banned, and persists currently despite universal nominal opposition. The pattern implies slavery is fundamental to how complex societies organize, something that changes form but never disappears entirely. Yet Spartacus didn't know this history when he escaped the ludus with 77 other gladiators. He didn't know he was repeating patterns that had failed repeatedly, didn't know his rebellion would be crushed like all previous rebellions. He knew only that freedom was worth dying for, that living as property wasn't living at all, that some things matter more than survival. That knowledge remains true regardless of historical patterns. Every person currently enslaved faces Spartacus's choice: submit or resist, accept degradation, or risk death fighting it. The crosses along the Appian Way were meant to ensure no one made Spartacus's choice again. They failed. The choice has been made by millions of people across 2,000 years, continues being made today by people whose names won't appear in history books. Most lose like Spartacus lost. Some win like Haiti won. All of them demonstrate that human spirit cannot be permanently broken regardless of violence applied. Rome could kill Spartacus, but couldn't kill what he represented. No subsequent empire has managed it either. The rebellion that started in a gladiator school in 73 BC continues in different venues under different names. The essential conflict between people claiming ownership of other people and those people refusing to be owned remains unresolved because it's fundamentally unresolvable through anything except one side's total victory. Spartacus chose his side, history chose its verdict. But the war isn't over. It's never been over. It won't be over until slavery is actually abolished everywhere. Not just legally prohibited, but practically eliminated, and no human being is property of another in any form under any name. that future might be achievable. The trajectory isn't encouraging, but trajectories change through human action. Spartacus lost his specific battle, but contributed to slavery's eventual decline in Europe. Current resistance movements might lose specific battles while contributing to slavery's global elimination. Victory measured across centuries looks different than victory measured in lifetimes. The cross is rotted. The idea survived. That inversion of expected outcomes is the only hope that systematic change is possible.